Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming this morning. I just have one announcement before I introduce our speaker for today. The next SCCR Science Series is April 6th from 9 to 11 in LKSC 208. That space is much smaller than this space, so if you are interested, the topic is the art of induction, how art and technology can help us improve the care of sick children. So we have a pediatric anesthesiologist coming to talk to us about some work he's doing in LPCH, specifically with induction anesthesia with children. So if you're interested, please let me know, or if you haven't received the information for the flyer, I'm happy to send it to you. We still have room in that signups for that speaker. I think that's all. That's the only announcement I have. So I'll introduce our speaker for today, and then the floor will be his. So Andy Lawton, this is his second time to Stanford. We invited him back after a lecture that he gave last year on risk-based monitoring. He has extensive experience in computing, statistics, data management, system design, and risk-based approach in clinical trials. He was invited to speak, like I said, last year, and he's on a 3-week trip to the U.S. and was wondering if we'd be interested, and we said to come on back. It was a successful presentation that he gave last year. So he started his own company last year and is the director of Risk-Based Approach Limited. Previously, he held the position of global head of clinical data management at Boehringer Ingelheim, which is a global research-driven pharmaceutical company. And he is a founding committee member of the Association for Configuration of Data Management and a member of Transcelerate Risk-Based Monitoring Workstream. So please help me in welcoming him back to Stanford. There you are.
Good morning. I hope there's not too much feedback comes through. So it's a pleasure to be back here, even if you've got a bit of wet weather. Dear, oh dear. I thought it could be England. So I'm coming back to talk about ICH E6, ICH GCP. I know whenever I was faced with doing ICH E6 training again, I'd find whatever excuse I could, slip my wrists, hang myself, rather than do GCP training yet again. But I think you'll find that the changes within GCP impact you more directly. It's become much more focused, and it's going to become more focused over time. As always, I'm going to show you pictures from holidays and everywhere else. As I've said, I'm very busy, but I still go on holidays. This one was a cruise up the Amazon to Manaus, 900 miles up the Amazon. My wife thought we'd have to reverse out. She didn't realize the river is still 2 miles wide at that point. But I was doing a business there, so I'd gone ashore, found an internet cafe, and I was doing my telephone conference from there. Then, after 30 minutes, it cut. I wasn't allowed to access it anymore, so I was walking the streets and found another cafe, started it again. Unbeknown to me, the police had been called because I wasn't on board the ship and it was getting late. And so I got there with 1 minute to spare, so it was okay, but this was my friendly policeman and host to direct me back on board. But what we're going to talk about today is the ICH Addendum. It's been in development for a couple of years, and it's a paradigm shift. It's going to change the way we think about quality. Quality within clinical trials, I always said that as pharma companies, we had no quality, which was an exaggeration because they spend billions on it. But it's also true that they don't measure, and they don't have a good measurement method for quality. And so this will change how we develop, monitor, and report clinical trials. And as well, there's a few changes for the PI. but the changes in this version are mainly for the sponsor. So I'm going to cover the ICH background. I'm going to cover it in two ways. The structural background of what's led to it, details of the word count, things like that, and then the non-structural changes. Since about 2009, when I started risk-based monitoring, I've become an expert in the field. I was called into the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative meeting in 2011 to present to the FDA and EMA on what was possible and what we were doing. And I, at that point, started conversations with all the regulatory people. So a lot of the feedback is feedback on what their thoughts are about industry quality. And so when there are some harsh quotes in there, that's not always me saying it, that's the regulators. So what's led to these changes in the ICH E.6 Addendum? Well, you've got to go back to the 1996 version 1. 20 years we've had it. Q9 is the manufacturing side. In 2009, that introduced the concept of the risk-based approach. In 2011, we had both the FDA and EMA guidance, draft guidance on risk-based monitoring. Those two slightly diverged. The FDA continued in their final guidance, really focusing on the risk-based monitoring, whereas the EMA changed their focus. They started talking about quality by design, and they introduced the concept of quality tolerance limits. ICH started its changes. They met first of all in 2014 on this, and it was about 2 years before they got to the final version in November of last year. I've kept open my discussions with them, and so I know the background to the discussions that they had in Lisbon in last year, what the arguments internally were between the different groups, so I can give any of that if you're interested. Now, the focus on this addendum, virtually all actions for the sponsor. Computer system validation is now in ICH, what you have to do. And it's there because of the importance of electronic data now. In 1996, we were in a paper-based world. And that's when ICH was written. We're now in an electronic world. Although, unfortunately, most sponsor companies still act as if it's paper. They still look at the data right at the end of the study. They don't do their queries on time. They're not responding to the fact that they've got instant data and they should be taking instant actions on it. The concept of quality management system, we'll go through that. Tolerance limits, which I think is going to be the biggest impact on the industry. I'll spend a bit longer on that topic. And not just the industry, but all sponsors. If you're running a study yourself, then you are the sponsor. And finally, the quality report. And those few bullet sections down there at the end are the only sections where it's an investigator's responsibility. As I said, I'd show you pictures. The future is flooded. We're going to get more data. It's muddy and it's contaminated. This is actually the meeting of the rivers at Manaus. The River Negro on this side, effectively a dead river, has the set pH of lemon juice. And so you've got a city in the Amazon of 2.5 million people, no mosquitoes. Because they can't survive in that water. Great. And this, of course, is the tributary that forms the Amazon, full of nutrients. It takes about 15 miles for those two to merge. But it is complicated. We're getting different data sources coming in, electronic medical record studies. And that brings very different data than the traditional clinical trial. And whilst we've always regarded the traditional clinical trial as the holy grail, it's not. I think as a Nature study, I don't know whether anyone looked at that in January of this year, pointed out that 85% of clinical trials the results cannot be replicated. That's not a very robust method to use. And so they're saying we have to have better methods. Of course, the river Amazon floods every year, rises up about 14 to 16 meters. So they build their houses on stilts. But as you can see, the tide mark on these buildings indicates stilts aren't always successful. And so we've got to come up with different methods. Now this house, and it was our boat driver, and he has his 9 children and his wife in there and several other people. Well, that's on logs. So when it floods, it rises up. And that's what we've got to introduce, methods which adapt and are adaptable, not that are fixed. Too often within the industry, we've tried to do fixed methods, and we can't cope with all the changes we're seeing. We can't cope with analyzing social media data for adverse events, and yet that's coming. It's already started. We're going to have to model the data in future, and that's the essence of what we're going to see within ICH E6. And we're already getting an indication of that modeling. This is the part of the picture that I showed you before. But I want to talk about the new guidance on quality metrics data. This has been released for the manufacturing side. That the FDA is now saying, okay, you're going to have to give us metrics on your production methodology in a standardized format, and we're going to use that to determine when we inspect where there may be issues. Now, ICH just been released, but also in January of this year, they released the ICH renovation project, because it's been pointed out that ICH is still really dealing with the traditional clinical trials, although some of the methods can be expanded, and they're going to formulate 3 annexes for ICH E6. And they will go into detail on how to handle or what you need for different types of trials. For the traditional randomized clinical trial, for electronic medical record trials, for health economic studies. So they all come under this arena. And the methodology that's being given to us will mean that we can adapt that data and bring it all in and view it as one. Now, I foresee that by about 2020-22, metrics will be required on clinical trials on a routine basis. There's already been the hints about that, because for any of you involved in submissions of products? No? Okay, one. When you submit products to the FDA, you have to submit what's called the site data set. The site data set has to list every site that was involved in every study. It has to say how many adverse events there were, how many deaths, how many patients randomized, how many screen failures, protocol violations. And they have expanded that last year to say they also want risk metrics. So they use that data set to select which sites to inspect. You know what? They always find the problem sites just by looking at the metrics. And so think of what they can do when they actually get our risk indicators as well in there. So it's going to be a metrics-based future. Our traditional way of paper handling has to go. but it will be a slow changeover. Inspectors don't always take on board things instantly. So, apologies for the color, where it's come out. This is the word count changes in ICH E.6. This is the 1996 version. Number of times the word monitor is used. Then we have draft 2, and finally, step 4 of draft 2. This one is R2D2, release 2, draft 2, nothing to do with Star Wars. So how is it changing? Well, monitor is increasing a lot. That's plan monitoring, centralized monitoring, the scope of monitoring, the risk-based approach to monitoring, that's where it gets increased. Quality increases, quality management systems, quality tolerance limits, that's where that's coming from. Risk increases. In the 96 version, risk was used very negatively. When we get to the draft 2 versions, it's much more positive. It's about managing risk, handling risk, and that's the future. Systematic also increases, and we'll be talking a lot about systematic issues. Oversight, first time it's mentioned. Yet how many findings of lack of oversight have we seen in publications from audits? Now you can expect even more, because they want a more structured way of doing it. A root cause, that's particularly important when we look at some of the methodologies we'll be using, better root cause analysis of issues. It's not acceptable to always say, oh, it was training. Training, if our training is so bad, then we should really go back to the beginning again and say, what's bad about that training? What should we do about that? We don't look in depth, we stop at the symptom. And we have to go much further. So now looking at the drivers, and this is the feedback from the regulatory authorities. As part of Confidentiality, which was the industry body formed of about 20 pharmaceutical companies, I think all bar one of the top 20 were in there. I got the opportunity to present to the EMA, the inspectors meeting, the FDA. I was at the city meetings, and also directly to the PMDA in Japan. So I'm keeping up that conversation because I'll be talking to them this coming November when I visit Japan again. So they have concerns over the quality. They don't trust the statement we make in our submissions because we base that statement on audits. We say in any drug submission, we have conducted X number of audits. We derive from these that our studies were conducted to ICH GCP. And they go out and do 2 inspections and then say, oh, no, it wasn't. Because they always find issues. And of course you can find issues. Now they're stuck in a difficult place because if it's a good drug and they want to accept it and they know there's issues there, there's a potential that if they do accept it and there's problems later, Congress will come and beat them again. They should be used to being beaten by now, but they're not. So they want to put the responsibility back on the pharma industry and on sponsors to understand quality better. They're upset over the lack of transparency. We're a bit secretive in the industry. We're not what, I wouldn't say the people are not trustworthy, but the processes we go by are not. And so we have to be more transparent about quality. When we do find issues, don't lift up the carpet and sweep it underneath. They can lift up the carpet and see it's there. So we have to do better. They want defined quality. And they're giving us the methods to do that. Quality by design. They often think that quality is by chance in our clinical trials. too often the protocol is not good enough. That really impacts on every process. No amount of good monitoring will rescue a bad protocol. When it's bad, it's bad. They see within Big Pharma that we're too siloed and that we have islands of quality and the rest is a sea of poor stuff. So they want demonstrable oversight, better root cause analysis. And this was a quote from Fergus Sweeney: the stupidity of 100% SDV, that you have your head buried in the documentation and you haven't got that helicopter view of what's actually happening at the site. That in the next room they're making up the data, but you're just checking that those numbers are the right ones. So they want better oversight at that site level. And overall, there's a goal to make us more efficient and effective. They want the cost of drug development reduced. They want more drugs on the market. These are all good things for the industry, but the industry is a bit reluctant to implement many of them. They want quality by design, better protocols. They want feedback loops. The Deming plan, do, study, act cycle, they really want to see these quality loops put in place. So when we plan something, we undertake it, we actually analyze what's gone wrong and feed that back into our quality circle so we can improve it in the next protocol, not make the same mistakes again. Define quality. So up front, they want it predefined, what quality you're going to achieve. Again, what we've done traditionally in clinical trials is treated them as isolated islands and say, this is the study, just believe the results because it's a comparison and we've controlled everything. The truth is we haven't. Then we make the fatal mistake in a submission of merging all the data together and just say, believe us, even when there's radically different results. Improved oversight. So they want a defined monitoring strategy. Strategy. Why are you doing on-site monitoring? What are you going to achieve? They do envisage that in the future we will do all centralized monitoring only. You might just have some for cause on-site monitoring. You might still conduct an initiation visit, but that traditional way we monitor right out. But they want us to have the strategic view of why we're doing it and what we're going to achieve with each part. And they want to focus on issues that matter. I can tell you what their definition is, even though they haven't put it in the document. But it's about systematic errors. They're the ones that concern them. What they're going to give us in the future is the ability to specify that we have random errors, that we're not going to go for perfection all the time. But from that, they want continuous improvement. Again, go back to the Deming plan, do, study, act cycle. It's a simple concept. Use it. Other areas. PI control of source data. It's still not clear that anyone can meet those requirements. This is where they've gone back a bit negative, I think. They've still harking back to the paper days when the PI kept a copy of NCR paper and they thought that that meant they had control of the data. Of course they didn't. But they still view that concept has to be implemented in electronic format. Unfortunately, most of us, or most companies, when they finish a study, they take away the study's access rights to it. They can't even see the data anymore. That's not going to be acceptable in the future. Nor will it be acceptable just to give them a paper copy or to give them a PDF file on a CD. So that's going to have to be worked out how we do that. I have got suggestions. Audits. not useful as a quality tool. Within the industry, typically, we cover about 1 to 2% of sites with audits. Virtually every audit shows issues, and yet we make a claim from it, we meet ICH GCP. How can that be? Just because you fix the problems at that site does not mean you fix the problems globally. So it's going to be about defining that. They don't measure quality across the organization. There's no predefined quality within them. And it doesn't make a bad site good. I think that we found that out very early on in our risk-based monitoring back in 2009 when we implemented it. Our head of QA wanted to know what the impact of audits were. So we measured the scores of the sites, color-coded them, and so you'd have a red site that had been an audit, and then for 2 weeks, maybe, they'd improve. And then after that, same as usual, back to red. Sometimes they even got worse because they were so focused so much on trying to answer audit issues, they didn't have time for the clinical data or observing what the real issues were going to be. They were too focused in the documentation. And that comes in that when you have poor sites, you shouldn't use them again. Unless you've got some magic wand that you can make them good, but no one's yet found that. So that's a big issue. But they're not saying abandon audits. They don't want us to, we're too good at that. If they come out too strictly, the industry just abandons something and says, oh, we're not doing that anymore, you told us not to. There is still a purpose to audits, just not the way we use them. And so we have to be better focused on that. So I'm going to talk about ICH. These are hyperlinks, and I'll be sending the actual presentation. You can use it as a sort of training tool, because if you go to this hyperlink, it takes you to the actual ICH text, and there's a back button to bring you back here so you can flow through the whole thing. So the emphasis on this introductory session is to say the scale and complexity and cost of clinical trials have increased. But evolutions in technology and risk management processes offer the opportunities to increase efficiency and focus on relevant activities. That means the risk-based approach, focusing on what matters, and using technology and processes to help you reduce costs. So that will take you to the actual sections, and you can come back, you can page back through it, and you can come back to the relevant section if my mouse works. Oh, that's it. Right. These are the sponsor's responsibilities, the changed areas. Now again, each of these are hyperlinked, so you can go down them. First of all, quality management. What's under quality management? Well, it's quality by design. They want those aspects built in. Non-compliance. The risk-based approach is not just for clinical trial, it's for the whole area of the company. And one of the examples, I'll give that later. CRO oversight, very important area. They want companies to have oversight of the CROs. In particular, some sponsors have put out all of data management, all of on-site monitoring, all of statistics. They don't know how they're going to run their trials anymore. The regulators don't know, that they think they've got no knowledge of the process. And as we'll learn later about Deming, having knowledge of the process is essential if you actually want to understand what's going on. He called it profound knowledge, and we'll be talking a lot about that. Then, of course, on to the monitoring area, risk-based monitoring. Talk about the nature of monitoring, monitoring report, centralized monitoring, and the monitoring plan. All require changes. And then on to electronic media. They're talking about computer system validation. They also talk about that at the site. So PIs have to know whether there's an audit trail for their systems. No. It's keyboard, they know that much. How are you going to help them know that? Talk about essential documents and the certified copy. Because, of course, back in 96, they weren't talking about electronic certified copies, they were talking about paper certified copies. And all those processes that were on paper are now on the computer. So let's go into quality management. Throughout, this will be the ICH text, and the red text on the right-hand side will be my commentary on it. So they talk about proportionate risks methods related to the risk, i.e. the risk-based approach. You don't have to use the same methods for everything. That's why 100% SDV is wrong, because you're not focusing. And the truth of the matter is, CRAs rarely do 100% SDV because they don't have the time. Companies don't give them the time to do everything. So they'll focus on what they think is important. And maybe one CRA focuses on something different from another. So you have no real understanding of what is going on at site. Another part, standard medical practice. It's often forgotten. People write protocols and think that that's what the sites will do. They'll follow them. No, they have their standard procedures that they conduct themselves. And whenever you deviate from those standard procedures, it will create issues. Protocol violations, protocol deviations, or whatever you call them. So as close as possible, the closer you can get to standard medical practice, the better the conduct of your study will be. Better the compliance. And anywhere where you deviate from that, the more you're going to have to focus on managing that. That becomes a risk because you're not following it. Now, we've got used to doing global multinational trials. We can do it now. We've got the technology. But we forget that each country virtually has a different standard of medical practice, and they do things differently. Even different states work on different ways, different hospitals. And we've got to understand what is the base level that we can achieve. And if we want to go into global studies, you can't have really complex studies. It won't work. You're going to have major issues. And the quality management system should use a risk-based approach. That's throughout your organization. You've got to identify critical data and processes prior to the final protocol. So that means you've got to run your risk assessment not as an afterthought, but build it into your process, into an early draft, because you want to mitigate for those in the protocol. You want to change the protocol to address the risks, not try and monitor for them and address them, but eliminate them as far as possible. Risk identification talks about two levels. The industry has focused on the trial level risk, but they talk about a system level, the company risk. And in a recent inspection, it was 2000, well, it's not recent, it's 2015, of Glaxo. I know this from a Glaxo colleague. The MHRA, the UK inspectors, came in and they were looking through all the records, and they found an on-site monitor that they'd seen in a different company, and they hadn't liked their work. Well, rather than go down and say, let's see if we can find the same problems here, they asked, what's your employment methods? Do you use interview notes? Were they returned for this? Do you do assessments? They went up through the organization and across. In future, if they find that an on-site monitor did not have enough time to do the job, they go up the organization and say, who in the organization knew? Do you have a manpower allocation tool? It would be the same for budget. If there wasn't enough money, where's your budgeting process? So it goes across the organization, it's not just for clinical this is for HR, for finance, for the IT department. Bigger impact. On the type of risk assessment, they talk about a FEMA type analysis, failure effect mode analysis. This gets complicated. So you really want to have one expert in the organization on that, not everyone trying to do this. It's too complex and too open to issues. But basically, it's looking at the likelihood of errors occurring. You multiply that by the extent to which you could detect them and the impact. And you take that combination of the three to work out a scoring and what you can do about it. Risk control. Well, we've got a tool for risk control. That's the Transalerate RACT, Risk Assessment and Categorization Tool. If you go to the Transalerate website, you can download that if you want. It's available free of charge. Many of the systems for risk-based monitoring have built that in. It's not too straightforward at all. You've got to get some experience the first time of using it, but afterwards, it only takes about 60 minutes to run a new protocol through it. And you should repeat that often. And you should document all this in the Transalerate Integrated Quality and Risk Management Plan, where you bring all the plans together and have one oversight concept of what you're doing. This is tolerance limits. I'll be going into this a bit more later. It's not the first time they were mentioned. It actually came in the 1995 draft of ICH E.6 version 1, but it got dropped before that final release. In that version, it was the responsibility of the statistician to define the quality tolerance limits. And everyone in the industry was looking at each other saying, what's that for? Don't understand that. And I think the industry pushed back because industry is part of ICH and no one could explain how they did it. But it's been 20 years. We've noticed the gap. It's still needed. But the basic concept, you have to predefine the quality tolerance limits. That means telling them what your quality is going to be before you start. And it's got to consist of using the medical and statistical knowledge. The design of the trial, knowing that the design of your trial will impact the quality. Tells you what to focus on, subject safety and reliability of the results. But unlike in manufacturing, where you try to make a car door, if it's too big, you throw out the car door, you can't use it. Here, they're not saying that. If you deviate from the quality tolerance limits, it triggers an evaluation to determine if action is needed. What type of thing is that? A sensitivity analysis. We're used to doing that anyway. What is the impact on the results? So they're not deviating too much from what we expect. They're not being too strict. They're not telling us what to measure yet, but you can expect in time they will. When I presented this to some companies, they've said, I'm going to create really wide limits and then we'll never have issues. And I just give them an example. I said, would you travel with an airline that says it's going to perhaps crash 20 times a year? Or would you go with the one that crashes only two times a year? What's your choice? And you think of, if you're going to have to predefine this to both regulators and to patients, at some point, patients will get to know about this. Are they going to say, oh yeah, I'll use that drug, only 20 deaths in each trial? Yes, that's for me. No, they're not. So that transparency still isn't quite there within the industry. We'll fight on that one. I'm actually putting together a letter to the BMJ to suggest that they should request quality tolerance limits on any study before they publish it. Ooh, that would put the cat among the pigeons. Risk communication. Says communicate. Who to? The stakeholders. Who are they? It's not just the regulatory bodies, and it's management, of course. What about the IRBs? They're responsible for monitoring the study, having oversight of the monitoring. Should you tell them what the quality is? Instead of just sending them a report every now and again about a protocol deviation, maybe up to 2 or 3 years late in some cases. No, we've got to have a better method of integrating them into the process. And the risk review, I'd advocate using the Deming cycle, Plan, Do, Study, Act. It's really simple. We'll be going through that a bit more. But don't expect risks to remain the same throughout the conduct of a study. They will change. And you've got to be adept at moving to those changes when they do occur. And risk reporting. Now you have to report out the quality tolerance limits, deviations in the clinical study report. Not hide it away in the submission or do it later. It's got to be upfront, continuous basis, and you should be reacting to that in your quality management system. Oops, back again. So that was the quality by design aspects. The CRO oversight, do you use CROs? No, okay, well, we will cover it then. That's gone to the wrong one. Yeah, just a moment. That's sort of that one. I inserted a slide and it's obviously pushed everything off. I will adjust it when and send you the final version. The sponsor should ensure oversight of any trial-related duties and functions carried out on its behalf. Nice and simple. That's going to create so many findings. If you thought there were some before, there will be many. I know that AstraZeneca, they're one of the few companies that implemented quality tolerance limits. They did it in their vendor management group and implemented it for their on-site monitor, CROs. And they were measuring inclusion, exclusion protocol violations. That was the measure they chose to use. They found it very effective. Good management tool. It demonstrates oversight, demonstrates that they know what's going on, control of the situation with continuous improvement. I was on the Transcelerate team with their clinical colleagues, and their clinical colleagues, unfortunately, hadn't been told what their vendor management colleagues were doing. So I actually informed them that that's how they did it in their own company. Now their clinical colleagues, they're probably the most advanced at implementing quality tolerance limits, because they've now trained all their statisticians in how to do this, and they're moving forward to define them for every study. Because you've got to remember, ICH released in November, implementation date in the European EU area is June. FDA will follow shortly after that, I guess, or maybe at the same time. In Japan, they've given them until the end of Q1. Now, does that mean, oh, well, all our existing trials are okay? No. Think of the statement you've got in every protocol that you run. It says, this trial will be conducted to ICH GCP. It does not say it will be conducted to the 1996 version of ICH GCP. It's going to be run to GCP. So from the middle of the year, if you haven't done risk assessments on your studies and have started to implement this, not just on your new studies, but retrospectively going back to ongoing studies, and do it then. Big impact. So we'll now talk about the monitoring activities, and we'll go through that. The extent and nature of monitoring. They're quite clear. People like Gabrielle Schwartz from BfArM, she's the lead inspector for the German organization, and also the EMA representative on ICH, so an important lady. One size does not fit all. You can't have a risk dashboard and measure the same things for every study, because each protocol is different. And they've said, assess the risk in the protocol, not just do some metrics and just whatever with them. No, if you want to replace on-site monitoring or portions of it, it has to really be measuring what is critical in that trial. And so that means not one dashboard, but adapting it to measuring the risks in that trial. And they've made it clear that you have to have a strategy for monitoring. What is essential to do on site? There may be things that you always have to go back on site for. And so you may be there more often. In fact, with bad sites, you will be there more often than you were previously. But with good sites, maybe the ones you wanted to visit because they had the best pastry shop, well, sorry, you're not going to go to them. Maybe you may only go once a year because they perform well. Oh, and when we look at the numbers, 50 to 60% of sites do a great job. They need minimal time spent with them. Then you've got about 20 to 30 that, yeah, at some point they're going to need help during the study. And then the 20% of sites which they don't do a good job. And you have to be there. You've got to hold their hand. You're doing the work for them. But unfortunately, you can't do the source notes for them. And that's where the problem often stems from. And one key point they make, remote monitoring does not count as on-site monitoring, and it doesn't count as risk-based monitoring. They really hate remote monitoring. The reason being is that the way pharma did it was that when we said, okay, you can use other methods, some companies said, well, fax all the pages to us, and we'll do SDV remotely. We've got this bad process and we'll make it worse because we've got you to send confidential information over the fax line, which could be anywhere. And then they'd blame the site if they didn't redact. No. That's putting more work on the site. It makes it harder to do clinical trials. And the emphasis is making it easier. And anyway, SDV is a bad process. Why do it remotely? So that's not a good concept. You can still do remote monitoring, but you have to realize what is the purpose of it. You'll do telephone calls, but don't think that's on-site monitoring. They want you to define what you're doing on-site, what's the strategy for it. Centralized monitoring. This is the new area, and they're giving good indications of what they want to see done. It's not an exhaustive list. They also say, give examples of who could be doing it. Data managers, statisticians. That's not the exhaustive list. Clinical people can still do it too. But they've got to have that analytics, that ability to understand data, good root cause analysis, electronic root cause analysis, because often you find the issues not in the data, but in the audit trail. You have to know how to get to that information, how to use it to really identify. So some of these tasks are already being done. You've got data managers, you've got statisticians, but remember, they're now asking for centralized monitoring documentation. So you've got to be very careful what you define there. So identify missing data, well, we have our systems often doing that. Inconsistent data, again the same. Data outliers. Unexpected lack of variability normally lies with the statisticians. Protocol deviations, well, that's in many different groups. Examine trends. So they want us to be looking across sites and within the site at what's happening. Evaluate for systematic. Systematic, that's the important thing. That's what they really want to know. By quality tolerance limits, they're going to let us have some errors. They're going to say they're your freebies, the gift. But they want to know what's systematic. One of the reasons they want to know this is because SAS software, you're probably aware of them, big statistical programming group, they gave them a program called Jump Clinical. And with that program, we're using CDIS data sets, which we have to supply them for submission. They can press the button, and it is literally a button, and it tells them where the issues are in the data. And SAS have also given the same program 200 copies to the PMDA. And the PMDA now requires CDIS data sets. But this puts them in a problem, because now they press the button on the submission, and they say, oh, yeah, look at all these issues. What do they do? The company hasn't told them about them. There's lots of fraud, there's a misconduct, there's surprising sloppiness, rounding of data, there's innocent ignorance, individual occurrences, and yet we've kept quiet. We've just said, all conforms to ICH GCP. They clearly know it doesn't now, and that's the driver for doing that. They're also concerned, and it hasn't come, it was in the earlier versions that wording changed, but it's still in the World Health Organization data handling documentation. That was released in, I think, September 2016. It's Annex 5. If you need it, I can send it to Keela. In that is the World Health Organization concepts for how to handle clinical data. Right from the very beginning, the Alcoa aspects at clinic, right the way through computer system validation, data querying, reporting. And they have a real concern that our queries cover up fraud and misconduct. And I've got another story, because in Translate, one company wanted to see when we published a paper about the impact of SDV, and it showed that only 1% of data was actually changed by source data verification, and about 1.4% was changed by the system queries, and another 1% was changed by data management queries. Well, they wanted to see when those queries had any impact on the data. So they asked Medidata to rerun, to roll back the audit trail, to recreate what it looked like before the data changes were made. They did it on 2 studies that they'd submitted. They never published that data, but I know the reason why. It didn't change the results. And in fact, that confirms what I've known for 20 odd years, because we did this back in the 90s. But what they found, they had fraud and misconduct, which they covered up by the querying. And they hadn't known about it before. And as they'd submitted that data, like all pharma companies, they prefer not to come clean on that and admit it. So that's unfortunate, really unfortunate that this happens, but it does happen. Data managers, we don't intend to create misconduct, but we inadvertently do. So you've got to be really careful about running queries. I think we'll get to a position some years down the line where we won't do querying anymore in the way we do it at present. Or we're going to be very careful. You've got to analyze the data that you've queried and do pattern detection, do all sorts of fraud detection on it to make sure it's not been changed, it's not covering up fraud. And you've also got to look at the original data before it was changed to see whether it was fraudulent at the beginning. So that's a big area that's coming. And the reason they would like to get to a position where we don't query is because you're not going to be able to query electronic medical record data. You don't, when you get that information in, you can't do much about it, nor much about the health record data. You've got what you got, you live with it. They talk about us analyzing site characteristics and performance metrics. They want us to use that in our future site selection. Not to keep going back to the same old site because we used them before, no matter how bad they were. And they also want us to use that for targeted on-site monitoring. To look, who should you do more monitoring at? Don't just say, oh yeah, we saw that they're all bad sites, we didn't do anything about it. No, maybe that's the time when you do need to be out there to sort them out. So they're the monitoring changes. We've changed the monitoring plan, monitoring reports. You have to do a monitoring report on your central monitoring. My suggestion is that you try and accumulate that. You might run the report every week and look at risks, but don't try and report on it that often. Look at a trend and maybe do a report every 4 to 6 weeks. And that report can be with maybe the country that is running it, or the CRO, or the project manager. Think of simplifying this. Don't go into too much detail. Don't replace one detailed process of SDV with another one that's going to create more inspection issues. So let's look at the electronic media, computerized systems, and this is record handling. SOP should cover system setup, installation, and use, basic stuff. But we have to ensure all parties understand their responsibilities. In particular, they're trying to focus on the investigators should know their responsibilities with regard to electronic signatures and all aspects like that. So again, key. This is, again, a potentially very difficult one, because if we're moving data between systems, they want us to keep the context, content, and structure of its original, i.e. the audit trail. So if you're bringing in lab data from a lab vendor, are you bringing the audit trail with it? If you're bringing in ePro data, are you just bringing the data, the patient-reported outcomes, or are you bringing in all the changes that have been made? Very difficult to achieve that. So, but you know, if you want to understand the quality of the data, unless you're asking the vendor to assess that, or you're assessing it directly on their audit trail, you've got to be thinking, how do you bring it into your system so you can do it? And they think this is important for when you do go completely electronic, you can go back and check the quality, and that you have built that into your risk-based approach. Okay. Again, we've gone wrong. Apologies for that. Almost there. That's it. Right, now for the changes for the investigator. What they have to do, and how are we doing on time? Okay, we're an hour in, another hour. The audit trail. The investigator has responsibilities to ensure that any electronic systems in use in their site have an audit trail. That's a difficult one.
Sorry. I was wondering, I couldn't remember what CSV meant.
Computer system validation, yeah. Sorry, apologies for that. One of those abbreviations, I know it. So, yes?
So I had a question about the EPRO thing which you mentioned for the data management system. If a trial is going on where the filling in their questionnaires with the help of an electronic device and it's going in. So with respect to the changes which are being does the do we need like what exactly would happen in this scenario, like in this example, like where it's going into the database and
Yeah. The question was, for an ePro device, what data do we need to bring back from the vendor that has gone into a central database? Because it's almost impossible to bring that into our analysis tool or our data warehouse, because it's got such a different data structure, what I would advocate is that you take over the whole data with its audit trail, and that's stored, and you can analyze on that. But what you'll analyze in terms of your statistical analysis may just be the extract of the final data. But you've got to have the complete data there and be able, via your risk-based monitoring, to analyze it to see what's happening within it.
so like if there are 4 sites participating and they have to download their own data, individual site and keep it with
No, that's not the individual site, that's for the sponsor. That first one was for the sponsor, that if they're bringing in the data, they have to do that. What is coming for the site is that we have to give them access to that data so that they can still control it, whatever that means.
And if it is an investigator-initiated trial, like the investigator is doing it, have investigator-initiated trial going on. You know, the patient-reported outcomes are going into a central database, like the red tab database. But so going in and the monitoring is so like every site should have their own
The investigator-initiated study,
yes.
I think that this kills it. Because I can't see investigators being able to run this level of sponsor involvement. They're going to find it really difficult. And it goes along with the regulators' concerns over what those IIS do, and that they're actually covering up what are sometimes industry requested studies from the PI, and that they just do it on their own. So I think it's going to be really difficult for any PI to do an IIS in future. Tough one. Qualified. I mean, I can't take you down into this text, but I'll describe it. The PI is responsible to ensure that all personnel in their site are adequate. Anyone undertaking the study within their remit is adequately qualified. That includes any satellite sites as well. Difficult one again. How can they do that? They might have access to the qualifications of the people in their own group, maybe not all of them, but yeah, this is going to be difficult to have oversight. But because they are responsible, they're making it quite clear, that PI is responsible. If they're giving anything to anyone to do, then they have to ensure that they're qualified to do it. And that also comes under supervision. Not only do they have to check that they're qualified, they have to supervise that they're doing it correctly. I won't take you into the text again. It gets a bit boring after a while. Essential documents, that probably is worthwhile looking at. And this is where they're talking about they should have control of the documentation. Control and continuous access to the CRF data. Really difficult. It doesn't mean, as I said before, giving them a PDF. That doesn't mean they have control of it. So you could look at wording for the investigator sign-off. And this is what I've suggested to many sponsors, that they change the wording in the sign-off to say that they recognize that they have continued control of the data and can change it and request re-access to it at any time. Now that would be very difficult to achieve, but at least you're covering the letter of the law then. They have to maintain adequate and accurate source records. Has to meet Alcoa. So having defined that it meets Alcoa, if you continue to do on-site monitoring, how does the monitor check that it meets Alcoa? How does the monitor define whether a PI has oversight? Because they obviously don't always look at the records. They sometimes don't sign off the ECRF until the end of the study. That is also not going to be acceptable in the future. The EMA are also punishing companies where they allow them to sign off at the end of the study. They're saying, how can you sign off for 20 patients, maybe 4,000 pages, with one signature, well, 20 signatures at the end of the trial? Did you really review that? Your speed reader or something? No, of course they didn't. So they're saying they want continuous review and sign off. And we're actually looking at implementing some of those changes. But it becomes important, have you trained your on-site monitors in how to recognize what good Alcoa is? What's PI oversight of adverse events? They don't see everyone. Maybe what you're looking for were, do they have a meeting every month where they go through what adverse events have been reported in the study? Maybe that's oversight. What if it's item 10 of a 10-item meeting? And it only ran for 30 minutes and there were 50 events. Did they have oversight then? Maybe not. So the skills of the on-site monitor have to change. More investigative, less box checking. Insulting word, but in some countries that's all that's done. I know that in North America, traditionally, the on-site monitors, they really have done what we call source data review. Reviewing the source, knowing what's happened, then they go in and start checking. They've checked the Alcoa and all those aspects. If you go to South America, parts of Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, forget it. They just check the numbers. So they're the changes for the site, not too many, but it does impact the sponsor in that they're now going to have to check that these items are done during on-site monitoring. Now I'll come back to quality tolerance limits because they are so important, and I'm going to go through some of the processes and issues around this. Again, I've emphasized the text, predefined quality tolerance limits. Before the study starts, not at the end and say, yeah, let's define them now that we know we've met them. That's not the game. And you're going to have to tell them about it. Again, this is a big change for industry to actually upfront define quality. Its purpose to identify systematic issues that matter. An individual non-compliance for informed consent is not an issue that matters. It's important, but it's not the issue that matters. It's the multiple failures that occur that are issues that matter. That's the systematic. And we've got to report out the important deviations from the predefined quality tolerance limits in the clinical study report. So let's talk about how we might do that and what the background is. Well, the background actually will lead us back to Stanford. These are different quality initiatives, statistical quality control in the 1930s, and that was Walter Shewhart. Anyone know about Shewhart? He was a statistician. What they call the normal distribution shape? Bell curve. Why is it called the bell curve? No, it's not because it looks like a bell. This guy worked for Bell Laboratories, and he justified the price increase that they wanted to the US government because Bell had a monopoly. And he came to influence someone called, come on, move over. W. Edwards Deming, who had major impact. But who influenced them? C.I. Lewis, Clarence Irving Lewis, a philosopher and mathematician from Harvard and Stanford. He is probably the founding father of the metrics that we use and run the whole of the 20th and 21st century. So an important guy. But his thesis is so complex, it said that Shewhart had to read it 18 times and Deming read it 14 or 15 times before they understood it. But they came up with their methodology. And that's what is integrated in quality tolerance limits. The concept that there is random error that you can't change, but there is also systematic error that can be changed and should be changed. And that is the basis of all these different quality initiatives, statistical control, quality control. Deming brought total quality control, and he implemented it in other departments, not just on manufacturing, but also on HR, other groups that can impact the whole organizational quality. Now, what's come in other ones, the Kansai, Japanese-style quality control, total quality management from US Department of Defense, and Six Sigma. The whole basis is what Deming did. They're just fancy names, slight tweaking of it. But really, go back to Deming. It's a far simpler approach. He had a beauty for making things easier. He looks a lot like my father. I do wonder whether my mother was over here at the time, different milkman. But tolerance limits go throughout, and they're important. If you go back to why we need, or why some of the tolerance limits were so ingrained in the US in the Second World War, that came from our recent 100-year anniversary of the First World War. And as horrifying as it was, you have to know that 40% of the shells failed to hit their target because of quality tolerance limit problems. They weren't made to the same standard. They overshot or undershot. 40%. So come the Second World War, they wanted those quality methods, and that's where Deming came into play. He then went to Japan, and he is, after the Second World War, because he was given the task to help rebuild the industry in Japan. And he made them a powerhouse because they readily accepted those quality methods. After the Second World War, the US industry immediately dropped those quality methods that the US government had asked for. So Deming was very critical of US industry. He was eventually brought back to work for Ford and others in the 1970s when the club of the big three in Detroit, Ford and General Motors, they noticed that there was some competition coming in from Japan. They were starting to sell cars when it was their right to sell the cars. And much like the pharma industry, they were too inward-looking. They were just looking at what GM did. Ford just looked at them, and GM looked at what Ford did. And if they were doing the same thing, that meant they were okay. And that's much as pharma do today. They say, well, what's Glaxo doing? Oh, they're not doing anything? Okay, I don't have to do anything. And that's not good enough. So that's why they want predefined quality. So how do we get there? Well, if this is the total errors for a parameter in a study, that could be non-compliances, it could be inclusion-exclusion protocol violations, whatever they are. They're saying there's a random component of that, and there's a systematic component. And what they want us to use quality tolerance limits for, they want us to define what we've seen in the past, what is our expectation of what we've seen, and draw tolerance limits around that. If we breach those tolerance limits, we analyze. They're not saying reject the batch, reject the study, it's a failure. No, they're saying, tell us what's happened, explain it. What's the impact? Can we still accept the data? How do you go back? Well, I can explain that. That will be another hour's presentation, so we won't do that. But there's more than one component that's involved there. And what they hope that we'll get is something like this, where if this is time going across there, that our systematic errors, whatever they are, will decrease and just leave us with random errors. Because each study is its own plan, do, study, act cycle. You plan to do something, you do it, you study, you act upon that, and feed it back into your quality management system so you improve it in the next study protocol. You don't leave it as it is. How many plans do we have for studies? Monitoring plan, communication plan, training plan, all of those. Do any of you ever report on your training plan and say whether it was successful and what the failures were? Are all your staff trained 100% on every new procedure? Probably not. No organization is. What impact is that? What's the tolerance limit for it? Some companies have started to set that and say, we want 90% of staff trained on the staff trained on 90% of all new procedures, and to maintain that. And now they've set that, they're now saying, maybe we can get to 95. Set a tolerance limit. If it goes outside this, if one group goes behind that, below, that's when we want action. Why? To improve quality, get defined quality. So, sources for errors. Yes, question. The question was, how do you define the upper and lower limit for tolerance limits? Well, let's take one where we can easily get to it. There was the Transcelerate paper on using SDV as a quality measure. And within that paper, it defined that the expectation was about 1% of data has transcription errors. It also gives you a standard deviation there. So in normal quality measurements, let's say 3 standard deviations, which is fairly generous. Now, Ken Mahaffey, you may know him, was the last author on a paper from Stanford on loss to follow-up patients. That was about a year and a half ago. Number of patients lost to follow-up on 16 different studies. Now that's a perfect example of where you could do a follow-up paper on quality tolerance limits. What it actually showed, or the authors showed, was that the average rate was about 0.23% for loss to follow-up patients in long-term cardiovascular studies. But there were 2 studies there. One had about 9%, and the other one had about 12% loss to follow-up. Do you think there was a systematic component in those? Yeah, you bet. What did the FDA do about those 2? They didn't accept them, they rejected them. They said this is not good enough. They already know some of this data, but they want us to start using this information ahead of time to start planning. So any of the authors from that paper here? No. Okay, but I'd suggest you do a follow-up paper using quality tolerance limits, using the information you've got, because you can predefine what you would expect in a cardiovascular study for long-term follow-up, and when you should be analyzing to see what the impact is if you're not achieving that. So there are metrics that you can use. You can go back to your historical studies to get estimates of what the standard deviation should be. The norm is, though, to select about 3 standard deviations for the action limit, and within some processes they also have a warning limit, which is normally set at 2 standard deviations. So where do the sources of errors come from? Well, the protocol is a good source of error. You'll often see bad protocols. The reason when you start to do some of these analyses, you see, oh my God, look at that study. It's so many protocol violations or deviations or whatever. And so I would exclude some of those from my analysis because it was just a bad protocol. It's not something you would want to use to define going forward. Where else do you get it? In the countries being used. And why? You get more in some countries because different medical practice. And then, of course, the sites. Some sites don't have any. Most sites don't have any major protocol deviations or eligibility deviations. But some do. And look at where that is, and you'll find a systematic component within them. And the vendors that you use, they'll all create errors, and some of those will be systematic, so you have to try and eliminate those. Now this is an example that I used. I've changed all the study names, but it's one, we were creating a tolerance limit for the inclusion-exclusion protocol violations. We were actually just getting an estimate of how many we expected and when to react for our risk-based monitoring. So it was the inclusion criteria number 4 on what, the definition for diagnosis of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So we had data from 5 historical studies we could look at, and we could look at the inclusion-exclusion rate in all of those. There were some slight differences in the definition, but it wasn't too bad. It was close enough that we could say, no, that will form a basis. What we then did is I wasn't going to go back to every site and look at their data to see whether they were systematic errors. We just applied an algorithm. If there were more than 2 types of the same protocol deviation from a site, we said that was systematic. One we'd accept as random, but 2 or more were systematic. And you have to remember that some of them had 6 of the same ones. And every time they'd say, oh no, that's just retrain the site. Well, a very stupid site, if they make the error 6 times and you've retrained them 5 times, no, that's not good enough. So we did that, excluded them, and then we were left with, we didn't have systematic errors in these 2 studies, but we did in the other 3. So we eliminated that part from our calculation, which just left us with, we assumed the random component. From that, we could collapse it into our expectation. But that's not all you do. Because, now, of course, that's missing out on what you're doing differently in this study. So we utilize what Deming called profound knowledge, knowledge of the process. What difference is your protocol going to be? Is it a simpler definition? Is it a wider definition? That's going to have impact. You've got to adjust for that. The countries you're using. Are you going to different countries than were used here? Will that impact? The type of sites you select. We all know that the FDA and EMA have real concerns over our use of SMOs, site management organizations. Why is that? Because they report fewer adverse events than GPs. Why? Because when a patient gets there after 3 months, what does he remember? Not very much. He may remember the big events, but not all the little bits in between. Also the patient visit window. You know that when you run a phase 4 study and you get fewer adverse events, that's mainly because the patient has forgotten about them. You lose between 60 and 70% of events when you move from a 1-week patient visit window to a 12-week patient visit window. Do we tell the regulators about that? No. Do we model for it in our submission databases? No. Do we model for it in our pharmacovigilance databases? No. Perhaps we should. Because how can we incorporate other data when we really don't know the quality and what we've missed? And why focus on one missing adverse event from the source notes to the ECRF when you've already missed 70% of the events because you weren't even told about them? Issues that matter. The size of the sites. If you're going to 1,000 one-patient sites, will you get more inclusion-exclusion protocol violations? Yeah. No chance to learn. First patient, get it wrong. Okay, that's it. You've got it wrong. I can show you the curve of protocol violations per patient that you get depending on site size. And of course, it goes down. So if you want to improve quality, you go to bigger sites. How often do you hear that pharma say, okay, we've got a really difficult indication, it's cancer, we've got to go to sites with only 1 patient. Yeah, cancer is really rare. My problem with that is if I've got cancer, I'm not going to go to a doctor who only treats 1 patient a year, because they don't know what they're doing. I want to go to a site where they see 100, 200 patients a year because they've got a standard process. They know how to deal with it. They know the exceptions and what to do. So pharma is actually destroying drugs by marketing policies or by being risk averse and not wanting to take the risk that sites won't recruit. So I've got a big issue there. The experience of the site will also impact. So you use this profound knowledge, what you're doing in this new study, that is going to impact. And then you adjust that number. Now, I might sound critical of the pharmaceutical industry. I dearly love it and the way that we help patients, but we have to improve. So you use both aspects of this to determine what the QTL is. And some of this is imprecise. And it's a bit of, about that much. But it's better than not doing it at all. And if you are wrong in your estimate, the worst that's going to happen is you're going to have to do a bit more analysis than you planned for. What's the cost of that? Minor. So that gives you your overall expectation. Now on this chart, I normally put this with an assessment of lots of different companies, but I didn't think that was appropriate here. I'm just saying on here the different aspects of ICH. ICH would expect us to be around this level, the 9 going round. And I've looked at what the best practice is throughout industry. Not in one company, but in multiple different companies. You know, one's good here, one's good here, another good somewhere else. That's the best that industry has to offer at present. There are gaps. Okay, one company that I've assessed is not siloed. They're a small company. If you go to any big pharma, they're down in this area. What that effect of being siloed is very negative on the organization. And in implementing the risk-based approach, they want us to come together to do the risk assessment, the whole team. The hope from the regulators is it will help to break down the silos, that we'll understand what the common purpose is with the trial, instead of data management going in this direction, on-site monitor going there, stats going somewhere else. We'll all get together and we'll be focused. That's the intention. The degree of SOP cover, SOP detail, industry tends to document, so lots have got that covered. Adaptive monitoring and statistical monitoring, they need work. Central monitoring, there's only one up there, most are low down. Computer system validation, we actually exceed because we're actually doing too much. We haven't implemented a risk-based approach there. When we say we have to do computer system validation, we do everything. And what they're saying in the document is you can take a risk-based approach to it. If you've got a critical aspect of a system, do that fully. If there are non-critical aspects, you can do less. Quality by design, still lacking. Quality management system, quality tolerance limits, non-existent. There's only, as I said, AstraZeneca are the best there, but they still have a long way to go. And if you do improve quality tolerance limits, if you do bring that out, it's going to improve your QMS, which will in turn improve your quality by design. And because you need good root cause analysis to do the analysis on systematic errors, that improves this area, which in turn improves your central monitoring. So there's a real focus, which at least 3 of the sponsors I'm working with have now got on quality tolerance limits, to really say, okay, what do we have to implement? Where do we start? And this is something that's going to help them, because quality tolerance limits don't just give you the defined quality, they give you the continuous improvement. Compliance at entry rather than compliance at the end. They start you down into a route of real trial simulation. Now, we've been doing trial simulation maybe in our efficacy parameters. We have not been doing that on complete trials on quality. Once you can start to define the quality standard, if you know when you come to an interim analysis, you're in the right region for the number of events, for the number of deviations, and for efficacy, then it's much more likely that you can stop the study. So it gives you much better control overall of what you're doing. I don't know what's going to help in the silo nature. That's got to be a change right at the top of industry to achieve that. It doesn't help with pharma industry's concentration on cost saving at present, because whenever you tell a department to save money, they only focus down on their little area and they forget all their relationships with other groups. And so cost saving in this area, Deming's always said, if you want to save money, improve quality. Industry has forgotten that. So I'll finish on that point and take questions. I'm sure there's some more. They're reluctant to share it with anyone at present. I would hope that they will actually be specifying, okay, we do expect some errors to occur. That's not an encouragement to sites, okay, we'll be sloppy now, because sites tend to want to do a good job. They don't want to do a bad job. It's just sometimes we make it hard. And when you start to investigate these areas, one quality tolerance limit I've said we should be having is for the number of adverse events reported, because it is a key indicator. And we know we can adjust it. If we really want to have lower adverse event reporting, we go to China. It's not because they're such hardy people and never ever complain. You know why China's bad? They've got a systematic problem. They have 5 forms that they have to complete for a serious adverse event. It goes to the company, the hospital, the region, the country, and their main body. 5 different forms. What happens? Oh, I think we'll lose that event. Why do sites report or sometimes not report events to us? Pardon? Too much documentation. You know, sometimes it's by accident. They put it on one side because we train them not to report events. How do we train them? Because as soon as an event occurs and it's just started, it's not finished, they report it into us as we've told them to. So what do? We punish them. We bombard them with so many queries. When did it finish? If it's a serious event, we get our friends in pharmacovigilance, the heavy guys, to really send out even more queries. So what do they learn? Well, this event hasn't ended. Let's put it to one side, and when it's finished, we'll report it. They're busy people. They forget. So what should we do? Well, you know, what some of the companies are doing are now saying, oh, we'll look for those sites which have late events or too many adverse event queries, because we'll target them. What we should actually do is change the way we handle our queries. And maybe look at the type of event and say, you know, this event is a long-term event. It will take 6 months to resolve. Let's ask in 2 months' time. Or this event finishes instantly. Yes, we can ask them. We've got to be smarter. We're acting stupid. And so we can know from our profound knowledge what we should be looking at. And that's what we implement, not just as our risk-based approach, but our quality improvement methods. How do we do it better?
Have you looked into at all adverse events that at query state, and so that you're getting pounded with kind of queries? You say, okay, fine, we'll put that in.
Yeah. What we do is we know where it occurs, but we don't report back to site. Because if you ever did go back to site and said you've reported too many adverse events to us, we know where that information would end up, in the newspaper or in a medical journal. Company X told us not to report adverse events. So we don't do that. But what we do is we track it and then see if it's related to a CRA. because we don't just use metrics on the site, we accumulate those metrics to see, is this a training issue of that CLA? Is it a country issue? And some examples I've got of where we've had country issues because they've changed processes. So wherever you have management impact, be it a vendor, be it CLA level, be it a country level, where different managers become involved, you have the potential for issues. What quality tolerance limits also give us is they give us some knowledge management. Knowledge management consists of two parts. One part is the statistical knowledge, medical knowledge. The other part of knowledge management is structural knowledge, what to do in certain situations. And that's defining what to do in certain situations. We're defining our organization's tolerance, and we're going to react to it much earlier. You don't have to have some eminent committee reviewing each non-compliance. We've got the system doing it. When I wanted to learn about risk-based monitoring, I didn't look at what we were doing in the industry. The problems we have in clinical trials are called supply chain problems. And there's people like Amazon, Walmart, and big guys that have solved these problems. So I use their methods, and that's how I implemented the risk-based approach back before the regulator were asking. It's a metrics problem, and you can solve it with metrics and management of that. Question? Is there a good culture in the industry to actually address this? At present, no. I have been brought in at board level at 2 companies, and we're really starting to make the shift there because this is where it's got to come from. This is not just for clinical, this is for all the parts of the company. And it is a change in thinking because you know the way companies react when there's non-compliance, they run around like headless chickens. How could this have occurred? Oh my God. And yet at the end, they'll just say, oh, it's retraining. Crazy. There's no management of that. And I think it will come about because companies will start to get findings on the fact they're not implementing quality tolerance limits. And if companies just say, well, we're not going to change our thought process, we're just going to start measuring some things, then all they are is metrics. They have to change the culture, but it will take time. And again, it won't happen until one changes. And then they'll become like the Amazon of the pharmaceutical industry. They will start to accelerate. They'll be doing things quicker and everything else. And that's when those other companies will start to react because they're saying, how are they doing that? What have they done?
Can you give an example of adaptive monitoring?
Okay, for adaptive monitoring, when you're doing reduced monitoring, you've cut it right down, and you really want to focus on potential issues that may occur. So one of those would be the issue of, well, which sites do I need to scan the scan the source documents to make sure they've reported all the adverse events? Don't look at the ones that have low adverse event reports. That means nothing. Look at the ones with late adverse event reporting. Look at those with high number of adverse event queries, because as I just told you, they're the predictors. Those are the sites that have learned that let's put them on one side. So that's an example where, you know, knowing the process, you determine. When we look for protocol violations, we tend to focus on the sites where protocol violation has occurred. And what we should focus on is what are the indicators that a site has sloppy procedures? Well, let's look at those that have too many queries. Let's look at those that are late in responding to queries and focus on that. When you want to do more SDR, when should you do more SDR? Because you don't have to do everything. You should look for sites which are late in doing data entry. Because sites that are late in doing data entry, you're more reliant on their source notes. Their source notes have to be really good, because if you're coming to enter the data 6 months later, they better be really good notes. And so anyone who's late, you need the monitor out there to check on that. If they've got too many queries, again, that would be a reason to do more source data. If they're late at responding to queries, do more SDR. The only time you do more SDV is if the site has too high a transcription error rate. That's not all that often. There's not many times that you'll actually be increasing SDV. You will increase SDR more often. You will increase unreported event review, that scanning of the source documents to make sure all events have been reported. Because in that Transcelerate paper on SDV as a quality measure, we did find that the on-site monitor picked up 12% almost of unreported adverse events that sites hadn't reported, and about almost 4% of serious adverse events that they hadn't reported. And we've got metrics to think of here, and then I'll come to you.
And I'm about to go back into that field. Because for adverse events, ask general question. It has a full-on statement about please only ask general statements, don't ask any guidance. We don't want to get too many data, is basically what they're saying. But a lot of the data out there that show that is hits. And so yes, that's a great way to be going. And with that, because it's your site's going to
Yeah, and you'll tend to get a lot of noise. From my own analysis, and I'm going to do some more analysis on the data transparency website, which I'll show you. But this is the number of adverse events reported going up there, percentage-wise, and we look at the patient visit interval as I talked about, 1 week, 2 weeks, going out to 12 weeks. I'd agree. Adverse events, it just falls off like that. And by 12 weeks, you probably get about 30 to 40% of the actual events that you'd get if you were measuring instantly. If you look at serious adverse events, you sometimes get more, only a small margin, tends to remain flat. When there's something big happen to a patient, they remember it. So is this the issue that matters? I'd say yes. And the reason the FDA haven't pushed back and said, yeah, you know, everyone should do better monitoring, everyone should have a patient diary card, is because they're getting the big issues. And in fact, now they're pushing back, and the EU is pushing back to say, industry, you're telling us about too much. Only tell us about SUSARs, which is really small amount. And they're going to change their whole perspective as well, in that they are going to start talking about having safety committees. Companies will have to have a safety committee, and they will have to do a proper review of the data themselves and tell the FDA when it's gone beyond maybe a tolerance limit, when they should be reacting. Because you're not going to when we move to health record data, you're going to have so much noise in there that it's really only the serious events that you're going to be able to say, these are the ones we're really interested in and have to know about.
I guess it depends on the goal of your study.
It does.
A nurse researcher and symptom
Yeah.
management.
Yeah. There was an example of a British researcher, a doctor, who said the true adverse event rates for statins, 20% of patients couldn't tolerate them and they had to drop off. And he was so heavily criticized by academia and the government. Oh, you're just making up data, you're scaremongering. He's completely right, because he was going from the immediate data, the phase 2 data. But they didn't want that because it's a low-cost medication and they want to push that out there as the panacea for everything. And of course, academia tends to do studies, long duration, maybe 3 to 6 months the patient has come back. They don't see the early events. The patient has forgotten about them or begins to tolerate them. Yes?
Quite often the sponsor.
Yes.
For their own study. I think it's actually do you think looking into vision, department, school-wide initiative
When you choose an airline to fly, do you go to Joe, who's got a plane that is going to just take off, single engine, he'll take you across to Las Vegas, or do you pick one of those regular carriers? Now, Joe might get you there, but they tend to have more accidents. Should he have a quality management system? I think, as I said before, I think this could be the death of IIS studies, or certainly a restriction on how many we see. Those that do a good job will probably say, oh yeah, we'll take on some aspects of that. We've done studies before. We'll set some tolerance limits. They might just, you don't have to set hundreds. You might set 3 or 4. And that might be enough. But you should think about quality before you start. You should measure it and monitor it. And the industry has not been doing that, and nor have investigators. This is calling them, start thinking about that. Of course, the FDA won't punish them as much as they would a real sponsor, but they will have findings, as they are having findings on IIS studies anyway. There are real concerns. And if it's a true investigator study, I mean, it does carry some risks. If there's where's the oversight of what's going on? That's with the IRB. And what information are they getting? Not enough, if any. So they are high risk. Would I go into an IIS study? Probably not. I've been in clinical trials. Yes.
Something regarding the source data. So a C was added to the Alcoa.
Yes.
It's for complete. Can you explain the history?
What, Alcoa?
It's Alcoa.
It's the accuracy, legibility.
It's the complete.
Yes. Yeah.
Why was it added?
Why was it added? Because it was felt that investigators weren't focused on that. Where is it? Where's the Alcoa? Alcoa.
There were two more.
Oh, yeah, there's additions been made, but they're saying focus on this. The attributable, legible, contained phrase, original, accurate, and complete. Avoiding missing data and systematic issues, and that all of that information is complete within it. So they're talking about a complete package of information. This also comes into the WHO guidance, the World Health Organization guidance, because they felt they had to bring investigators back to this fundamental principle. You've got to remember, although it's not regarded as a law, is it, in the US, ICH? In the UK, it is law. And when you get an inspection, they caution you. They bring out their warrant card. They have a warrant card like a policeman. And they say any evidence, information you give can be used against you, blah, blah, blah. The whole works. So it's very serious. That will occur more in the rest of Europe.
ICH isn't a law in the United States, but it is an FDA-recognized official guidance.
Yeah.
And my question was, you mentioned that the European Union is expected to adopt this and that the FDA would do it soon after. And I heard June, but I didn't hear the year that you were
this year.
expecting that, this year.
June this year. Yeah, you've got 3 months. You've got time to go back over all your past studies and do a risk assessment that are ongoing. Because if they're going for submission, they can be submitted. And although it's not a law, you have committed in every single one of your protocols because you state this study will be conducted to ICH GCP. Now that was okay because before it was just on the PI and so, yeah, we'll commit him to that. Now it's on the sponsor. You gave that commitment. Or is that a protocol violation now? We didn't really mean it. No. We committed to the 96 version, which doesn't require us to do anything. No, you committed blanket to ICH because your study would not be accepted by IRBs if you did not commit to that. So you're going to have to follow this. To you and companies, it is a law. And you know what the word should means? You know must. You must do something. So anyone speed on the way to work this morning? Probably not in the congestion, but sometimes you speed, don't you? Yeah, that's a must. So you obviously don't do what you must do. Should is an obligation. It is best practice. If you're not going to do it, you should say why. You shall not kill. No one's killed this morning? Okay, so you do follow the should, but you completely ignore the musts. Okay, we've got it in perspective now. Yes.
Just have a question regarding EHR
Yeah.
versus the value access to private chart.
Yeah.
So how can I ensure that besides that only allow access to ensure that it's
Well, for SDV, I don't care because it's not that important. And there's few transcription errors, so why worry? For SDR, I am more concerned that they can actually review the context of the data. It's an increasing problem that some hospitals are saying, no, we won't, it's a confidentiality issue. And the UK government is tackling that. I know in the EU. It's been arisen in parts of Europe and they're starting to look at that. Why it's important that the UK government starts to look at these things, because, you know, because of Brexit, leaving Europe, the suggestion has been that the UK authority, the MHRA, will actually follow what the FDA have done, and there will become greater alignment between the two. So that is more likely than they will follow what Europe does. But SDV transcription is one error that can occur. How many errors can occur between any recording of the data right up to the way of submission? Give me a number. There's 32 places. Pharma spent 30% of its resources on clinical trials on SDV.
Can you just clarify SDV and SDR? I'm not 100% sure I know the difference.
Let me get another presentation up, if I may, and give you an example. No, that's fine. I'm happy to do this.
It seems to be very important for this point.
It is indeed.
So after this, I think there might be a little bit of confusion. So Andy's going to do another presentation on centralized monitoring. We'll take a break in between that time. Who has the roster, the sign-in sheet? Can everybody please sign that if you haven't signed it before you leave? Just make sure that you pass it around. Okay. Some people have it. Got it. Can you just pass it down this way? Thank you.
I think it might be. But you might have it in your later presentation as well.
If we talk about it at the next time, I can wait until after.
No, it's not in that one either. So let me see. I do want to find it. I'll find it after the break and give it to you.
Thanks so much.
But basically, the definition of SDR is probably the traditional way that on-site monitors went on site. They went to the site, they read through the source notes to see, is the study being followed? Are they complete? They're looking for Alcoa aspects. They're wanting to know what's happened to the patient, whether the protocol has been followed. They're looking for protocol deviations in there. They're looking for all those aspects. Okay. SDV, we defined as the transcription, i.e., that's what's in the ECRF, that's what's in the source notes. What you find is that you go to Eastern Europe, all they were doing was the SDV. People were not doing SDR. They did not review the notes. They got there, checked the numbers, backwards and forwards. That's all they did. I know in the US, parts of Western Europe, Japan, they do a full job. They go in, they review the source notes, but then sometimes they get waylaid. They see a serious adverse event that hasn't been reported. They spend all day on handling that. Do they do the SDV part? No, they don't. What they do is they say, I know this site, they're good. Yeah, well, yeah, just check those. And so we actually never knew what was going on site. And it differed by country and by region and by CRA. Some did it, some didn't. And that's why you still got transcription errors, because people didn't always check. And that's why they missed blatantly obvious things. 3 CRAs go to a site, and none of them had looked that the patient had signed the wrong informed consent form. It was for a different study. Ooh, ooh, ooh. 3 CRAs. It was the 4th one who found it. Yeah. Oh. These things happen. Yeah. And that's a systematic error. It's systematic because we could have known about it beforehand, that we'd done another study with that site. And so they saw the logo at the top and say, oh yeah, that's the right form. They didn't look at the number, they looked at the logo and just give that to the patient to sign. So if you're going back to a site and they've done a study before for you, and they're not doing it now, make sure you destroy all their previous informed consents. Make sure there's nothing lying around that they could go, yeah, that looks right. Right company, wrong study. You had a question? What you're going to see is that the acceptance that there is a certain level of random error, that some protocol deviations will occur. But what will happen is probably partway through their study, alarm bells will ring because they've exceeded their tolerance limit, and they'll start to analyze, well, let's look back at those, not on an individual site basis, but if you look at the metrics and start to look at the audit trail, and I've got some examples, we probably don't have time to cover them, where you can actually do an electronic root cause analysis and find out, you know what, this was misconduct, this was economic fraud, this was that. And you do find it, and I can show you some good examples of it. What they do, they probably cover it up most of the time because they don't want fraud or misconduct in their studies. But now they're going to have to be more transparent. In the large-scale study where we did it, we didn't even get an inspection from the FDA because we were totally transparent. We actually put a report in to say that 40% of sites had rounded their blood pressure. And we couldn't use the blood pressure data because of that. We found it, we eliminated it. We also found that 4 sites had actually, they'd reused a lung function test from one patient and used it on another.
Okay, so it's more about
But then feeding it in and using that for future studies. The reason that we had all 40% of sites had rounded the data was because we were recording blood pressure in a respiratory study. And respiratory physicians have no interest in blood pressure. Why are you doing that? It's all about lungs. So they weren't interested. We showed we were interested because we said, just take the blood pressure and measure within 2 points. We didn't say, do it sitting, take 3 measurements, do it with the same person. We didn't say that. If you wanted a good blood pressure reading, that's what you'd be saying. But we just said, take blood pressure. So they saw we weren't interested in it, and they certainly weren't interested in it. So there was a lot of 120s over 80s. Because we're not interested. If you're not interested in the data, then what you should do is not collect it. And that was a clear message in ICH originally. In draft 1 for this version, new release, the addendum, it did say only collect critical data. Industry pushed back and say, no, we've got to collect the rest. It's really important. But it's not. If it's not important, where your risks will come is that if you've identified critical data, you're going to focus all your efforts on that. That will probably be good, but your other data will contain some real nightmares. And because you haven't been focusing on it, they're going to come back and bite you. And so you've got to be very careful. And so what I hope is that in future, protocols will start to improve. That the industry has been spending a lot, but we haven't been learning from it. When I was in industry, we've become so secretive. The best way for me to find out the results of studies that we'd conducted was to go to clinicaltrials.gov. As for finding out what safety issues had occurred, forget about it. They go into the safety organization, ooh, can't tell anyone about this. Ooh, no, that's... So we're not learning, it's not being fed back into the organization. So it's not really quality. They think they've got it organized, they haven't. Until you measure it, you haven't got it. So as a site, you probably won't see too much. You might see that they're becoming, there's a bit more investigative part as to what the cause was, better root cause analysis. But again, you might not see that because they can do a lot of that from the database. And there should be, a lot of things should be dealt with more instantly. So some of the checks that are now being implemented will instantly tell you where there's potential fraud. Looking at duplicate values. So in a site, if two patients or the same patient has systolic, diastolic, and heart rate, exactly the same measurements for two patients at two different times, then that's a good indicator of surprising sloppiness. They're rounding. If two patients in the same site have identical lung function, FEV and FVC, then that is a definite sign that you've got to be out there. The way we've reacted in the past is not the way someone like Amex works. Whenever they detect something on fraud on your card, they'll call you. You get a call instantly. Different kind of use, you've used it in a different country. You have a telephone call, is this you, is it right? The way the industry has dealt with this, near the end of the study or at some point, oh yeah, there's something gone wrong previously, we'd like to look at it. What we've got to do is bring it forward. Would you be happy if Amex saw fraud and contacted you 6 months later and say, we think something's gone on your card? You wouldn't be happy with that. And we shouldn't be happy with that holding back and not looking on a continuous basis. We have computer systems that can do it. And in fact, that will be a big change, that the on-site monitor will look at the processes at site because humans are good at processes. The computers should look at the numbers because humans aren't good at numbers, but computers are. Okay, shall we take a break there? And we'll come back. I'll pull up those other ones. How long do you want? Give them 15. 15
minutes. So
yeah.
11 o'clock?
Let's get another cup of tea. Hi. Good to meet you. Yeah, Maya?
Maya.
Yeah. I've got something
Very
for you,
interesting.
Nicola. I hope you find it interesting. Good.
Yes, very good. Yeah, we're submitting an NDA this year, so this will be helpful.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, you mentioned that if you're doing a submission this year, you should look into...
It's probably a bit late for your studies.
Right. So, yeah, so I was going to ask you that. So if the studies are ending, so the last one, were the NDA, last submission, so that...
I'm not allowed to mention who I work with. Because I do a lot of fraud. Yes. Maybe what I've done for you. Taking a text that's in this presentation, look at my we've got it in the next. If not, what should we do? And that doing that gap analysis is essential. You should not have a chart to implement this by the time they right. In place. So you're expected to do that as soon as possible. Be involved. And the documents, it's 200, all the different words. You don't. Or you would probably got more. So, and I typically directly one go back to it. So I then well, I'm working with quality management. What the difference is, you've got to know what the inspector is thinking, why they think it's called. The basic text, we can just cow, we just say it's 200. It's not the whole concept. Anyway, we'll find this short on time. Well, your key risk is making sure that you know maybe an analysis done by jump. It's too late. Because if they do come to this, they will then say, well, yeah, this, what you've done is stuff. What are your plans for the future? Yeah, we want to know your quality organisation. If you said, well, no, we're not changing it, then there's a still requirement. It's bringing it into something. Yeah. There's a nice story in the popular red wine. My niece is in Australia and she works in the wine trade and she thinks the thing one of my favorite wines. I enjoy eating it. I'll see where I get to and make stuff on the way and then. No, it's manual.
You don't happen to know much about the regulatory bodies in other countries outside of Europe, do you? Like Saudi Arabia?
I did do some work, but it's some information.
Okay. I had my dissertation work published in 2010. It wasn't a drug trial, but it was a study. And on Sunday, or no, 2 days ago, I was just looking in literature, and I found an article. I said, oh, these people, have replicated my work. This is really great. So let me see what they found. And every single data point in the whole article of hundreds and hundreds of data points were exactly the same as mine. Except for they doubled the sample size, but they neglected to alter the statistics and the degrees of freedom. So I wrote the editor.
Yeah, I think so. Very
Again, to the desperate point of every single. Well, they did reference my paper in the review of the literature part, but they, and actually it wasn't just the data that were exactly the same, hundreds of data points. It was, the passages were the same. So they plagiarized my work, but they also falsified data. So that's just.
That happened to me in my PhD. I have finished it, so I stopped. It's for my so I've been driven by it.
So it'll be interesting to see what they do.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., falsifying data could be, I think it could be a jail sentence. I'm not sure, but.
Yeah, you said it was in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
Well, they just be handling that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's proving it though, isn't it?
Yeah.
I always do that. Let's get another tea.
Hi, I'm Jennifer.
Hello, Jennifer.
Very
Nice
nice to meet you. I direct a brand new office called Clinical Research Quality.
Oh, very good.
And the
Cards.
start is by, oh, I should give you my.
Yeah.
Miracle. See if I've got one. Didn't have a power cord, but it looks like there you go. And interesting. Let's really try. Oh, yes, this is one of the things I have a bunch of notes here. There's other people, groups, there's an ethics guy. Yes. Because, oversight in industry, industries study just to where they're going to change. And then there's if the data, Stanford, there, and where they're the data may go to another study and another study that might be company someday. If you want the study design, write your own study. You'll be assigned. You know, we've been careful not to accept oversight liability, right? But the monkey on the back. Right. And so now I'm hearing this one. We need to create enablement data. That sounds to me like code for you're doing all the work, accepting all the liability, and we're getting the data we get to use it.
The best way is to think, okay, let's normal line where your response that way, when you're the site, or they might be used by the sponsor to monitor it, but it's not their responsibility to find out. So those companies that say,
Says that the sponsor can delegate all of these responsibilities to absolutely, that would make sense.
so you can say,
And still event, they still
and you might expect a CLO to have its own one, its own contingencies, but they're not yours. So you can't practically hold something. Some
you have, I'm a nurse originally, spent 10 years in device engineering. So I'm used to quality system regulations and device manufacturing. Do you see, the whole device thing is so different. But I think so. This feels very familiar to me.
yeah, this is where when you go to
Very interesting.
That's what I'm talking about. So you
No, that's very helpful. Well, that's sort of the other thing. That's just curious. You know, we understand. I know, been involved in once they came. And like, very good.
Okay, so before we go into the last presentation, we're going to discuss SDV and SDR. Wrong mouse. So this is source data verification, and these definitions came from Translate, because when we Translate was formed in about 2012. The City Group, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative from the FDA, had met in 2011 to specify the risk-based approach. But we want to know how to implement it. And our first challenge in getting 20 companies together was to get their definition of SDV. And of course, SDV varied so widely. Not only what varied from company to company, but also from region to region. So we said, let's take it down to the basic components. And so we introduced the concept of SDR. For this, we defined SDV, the checking of the CRF against the source documentation to detect transcription errors. That's it. Now, that might not have been what you meant by SDV in what you did in the past. And what we wanted to be quite clear, that we didn't say we were getting rid of monitoring. You weren't always going to reduce monitoring, but we did want to reduce this component of monitoring, which is of low value. So what is SDR? It's a review of subjects' data across visits, considering previous visits and the quality of the source documents. You want to review it for the Alcoa criteria. Did it meet it? Review source documents that it documents the clinical data clearly and concisely, that it's all there. Ensure documents confirm compliance to protocol and show PI oversight. By looking at the source documents, you know whether they followed the protocol. That's where the protocol deviations come from. Looking for SDV at numbers does not detect protocol deviations. That's why when you have an experienced on-site monitor who is doing SDR, they find it, and an inexperienced monitor doing SDV, that they don't always, because they're looking at numbers and not the process. It's an analytical review with cross-checks to ensure consistency. So concomitant medication versus medical history or adverse events. You're doing that more in-depth analysis. So what would it look like if we're monitoring an SAE?
Are you going to provide those?
God. Extras. Yes, I can, of course I can. I'll send them to Kira. Okay. Monitoring of an SAE. I've got thousands of other slides, so you don't want them all. Because too many have family pictures in. You know, it gets boring after a while. Monitoring of an SAE. For SDV, you're checking the specified fields in the database against the source data. End of story. For SDR of that serious adverse event, well, you probably want to review the whole case, the sequence of events that led up to it, understand what was happening, check the medical history. Was it a pre-existing condition that just got worse? You want to know that. Check if all related adverse events have been reported as well. Just check for the name. You're not checking that whole details. Has that event there? Check if the concomitant medications have reported it. Again, just check the name. Don't go into the detail. Assume that they've got the rest right. And check if the PI had oversight. Again, look for that meeting minutes where it was documented that these cases were reviewed. That's SDR. Now, when we went out to our monitors, when we originally split it up in these two groups, and by country, we asked them to estimate how long it would take to SDV a visit and how much it would take to SDR. So we knew which countries were doing it, because when we got back from Eastern Europe, that it took 60 minutes to SDV and 15 minutes to SDR, we said, no, you're not doing the good job. You're not doing what we expect. And we could see from our metrics that we followed up, because we also measured, we were tracking whether they increased SDV or whether they increased SDR for issues. They kept on going back and increasing SDV. And it was 3 times more often they would increase SDV than SDR. And yet, if you look at the metrics from the regulators, SDR problems are 3 times more common than SDV. So there is a 9-fold difference in what they should have been doing. This was one example where training was justified. And we went back and we trained them all on what SDR meant and how to do it. But you have to become quite prescriptive, and you are changing CRAs that may have been doing the job for 10 years, but not doing it right. And partly it's management's fault. They introduced electronic data capture systems that tracked the amount of SDV that was undertaken. And if you track something, what happened? It's done, or it's measured. What you measured is done. We didn't measure Alcoa. We didn't measure PI oversight. If you don't measure it, it won't be done. So you have to rethink your processes to get to this new paradigm shift. Okay. We also, as part of our risk-based monitoring, we always collect the CRA's assessment of the site. What their touchy-feely senses tell them, because they're the eyes and ears at the site, and that should correspond to what we're seeing in our metrics-based environment. Because if we're not seeing that represented, it means that our risk-based monitoring cannot replace what they're doing. So, is that good enough on that part? There's many more examples of how we measure it and what we do by site for SDV, when we escalate it. For SDR, what we choose as a baseline and go up from there. That might not, the critical data might be handled separately, but for other data, we would start at 5%. Just as a check to make sure they can transcribe data and to ensure that medical records are looked at. You only get to 100% if it's misconduct or fraud, and for SDV, you don't increase SDV for misconduct or fraud. There's no point in knowing that the numbers are right if they're fabricating them. So that's your definition. Now, the odd part is the unreported event review, because that doesn't fit well in either of those models. And more often than not, you need to increase the amount of unreported event review because the indicators show that that's an issue. So you have to think of how your systems are going to handle that in the future. It is not SDV, and it's not quite SDR. Okay. Right, we'll talk about centralized monitoring. Get back to the topic in hand. Let's see. Okay. So the role of central monitors, it's come about fairly recently. Although we've done central monitoring as an organization, we've had data managers and they work centrally and they do central monitoring. We've had adjudicators, we've had medical review that's been done centrally. We've had statisticians that do some review. We haven't brought that all together. And so I'm going to be talking about the multiple factors that have led to these changes, the new regulations and guidance. I'm going to talk about some of the second and third generation methods that will come in the future. Where industry is at present in implementing what Confidentiality stated is fairly basic, and it has to go much further than that. So I'll talk about the impact of those changes on different roles and functions. So the FDA guidance on central monitoring, that was in 2013. Remote evaluation carried out by sponsor personnel or representatives at a location other than the sites which the clinical investigation is being conducted. It can provide many of the capabilities of on-site monitoring as well as additional capabilities. But they're already recognizing that what's done on site, monitoring has always been traditionally viewed, that's the on-site monitor, no one else does it. And what the FDA are saying, it's the organization that is responsible for monitoring the site. We should enable the on-site monitor with having the support mechanisms to direct them to where to look better for issues. On-site monitors can rarely see systematic issues, which at the press of a button, I can see. So why not use my expertise in directing them to say, well, we're seeing this pattern. Can you check that this is correctly being documented? Can you have a discussion with the investigator as to why they're rounding data, why they're not measuring it correctly? And if they don't stop rounding, then we're not going to be able to use them in future. Then, of course, ICH E.6, we've already discussed that. And again, they're indicating who they think should be doing it, data managers and biostatisticians. We have used clinical ops persons, CRAs, in doing it within Boehringer quite successfully. They did, the only comments came back from the on-site monitors in that they preferred the data managers because they didn't make the assumption of what was going on. Whereas when we were using the clinical ops people, when they were looking at central monitoring, they'd made the decision of what was going on and were too forceful with the site monitor in saying what they had to do. Whereas the data managers left it more an open discussion. So within Boehringer, that whole operation has now been, it was in a an area between clinical operations and data management, and it consists of both groups of staff. That's now all been moved into data management, albeit as a new function within it. And it's saying within ICH E6, the sponsor may choose on-site monitoring, a combination of on-site and centralized, or where justified, centralized monitoring only. So they're even giving you the opportunity. They're saying you don't have to be on-site. If you've got a model, if you're doing a study near standard medical practice, no invasive procedures, not a toxic drug, why do you need to be on site? What are you doing it for? Most of the things you can measure centrally, it's not high risk to the patient. Because you're following near standard medical practice, you're not going to get so many protocol deviations. There's not so much instruction. Please do this, please do that. You've forgotten how to do it. So they already know in which areas that should be occurring. When you come to your mega trials that you run, they're near standard medical practice. You don't need on-site monitors. You can do almost all of that centrally. You might need on-site, people on site to do site initiation, make sure the sites are trained, make sure they've got the right infrastructure. You might need an on-site monitor to go back when there's a change in staff to ensure that that new member of staff has good documentation practices, that they've got good Alcoa. But they don't need to be there all the time. And yeah, if you're doing a study where problems are being shown or where it's non-standard medical practice, you better have an on-site monitor there, because that's to pick up those issues that you might not be able to measure internally. They're telling us to think about it. A unique item there, think about the study. More on the extent, we went through these were the 5 pointers where they think a centralized monitor should be working and what we should be looking at. So they're key items: examining the data trends, unexpected lack of variability. They're trying to point us out. We know fraud is going on. We know there's misconduct. That's one of the indicators. Please look at it. Because when it lands on their desk, they know it's too late to do anything about it. They know it's going to delay the submission. And if they want the drug, and they're not, the FDA is not that bad. They're not pushing back so much that they say, no, we're going to reject good drugs. But they're put in a difficult position because we haven't explained it, and they're seeing it. If you haven't got a version of SAS Jump, approach SAS and ask for a free copy. Why not? They might give it to you. So you'll promote it for them. Okay. So what does traditional monitoring look like? We'll describe what the activity on site was over time. If this is the site, the red zone is the conduct period of the study, and that's time going across from right to left, left to right. So on-site monitoring, initiation visit before the study started, and then every 4 to 8 weeks an on-site period, on-site visit going. Just like in the old days when we had paper, they had to go and get the paper and bring it in-house. So we do the same thing, even though it's now electronic. And then there were edit checks that was run on the data. And we'd be sending out queries to there. There'd be peaks and troughs of that going through. And then we'd have internal quality review meetings. We do that, that's good practice. But what happens at those internal quality review meetings is we discover things we didn't think about. So we send out boluses of queries. That's where our data managers are creating misconduct. Not intentionally. They're acting on behalf of the trial team who's really creating misconduct. You've really got to understand that data and be willing to do analysis of it, of the query data, the change data, to see what impact it has. If you're not doing that, you're running a risk that there's things going on that the FDA will see later and you don't know about. So different models that I've seen for central monitoring. Well, some companies have said, well, we're not going to appoint a central monitor because we've got lots of functions. Data management do a bit, medical affairs, medical operations do something, ClinOps, statistics, they all do their bit. That really doesn't change the thought process in the company. It really doesn't bring risk into place. And so I'm not a great advocate of that model. It has been very quick for those companies to say, yeah, we do central monitoring. We can justify to the FDA if they come in. But what they've now put, of course, in the guidance is that those people have to do a central monitoring report. When should a data manager do it? After each query? Write a central monitoring report, this is what I did? No, they're not going to do that. Do they do it every 5 weeks? What would they put in? I raised some queries. I got some responses. No, that's not very good. There's no focus to it. What does a statistician or medical reviewer put in? It's difficult to know then. So that requirement for doing a centralized monitoring report, I think, eliminates that as the possibility. This, I've seen, used as a primary role for directing on-site monitoring, and that's how we adapted it within Boring, and I think most have done that, where you enable the on-site monitor to do a better job, where you focus their activity. You say, yeah, this is what we're seeing from the metrics, please look here. They're acting as a trainer. When you're looking at the metrics, you start to see compliance issues across the organization, and you can handle those immediately, whereas the CRA is seeing them in their site. Maybe not the other sites, but they're not seeing the big picture. So it enables you to see that overall picture. And then you've got the central monitor with direct contacts to sites. Glaxo have sort of done this model. Glaxo wanted, in 2011, as soon as the FDA guidance, draft guidance came out and the EMA guidance, you know, that you don't have to do monitoring of every patient, they immediately say, okay, we won't. We'll choose every 5th patient. They didn't implement any central monitoring. And then first inspection, they received the baseball bat over the head from the EMA. What do you think you're doing? You're not looking. You've taken something away, but you haven't replaced it with better monitoring. So they had to implement something very quickly. And they have implemented a very successful adaptive directed monitoring process. They actually brought in McLaren, the Formula One cars. Yeah? Because you know what McLaren are really good at? Predictive work. They get something like 3 million metrics during a race, and they know exactly what's happening with the car. They know Formula One have changed their rules, so they are not allowed to change the setup of the car, which they were doing. Because McLaren was so successful, they were adjusting their car based on the metrics to overcome issues and to make it faster during the race. And they said, no, if you start the race, you've got to start it the same car, everyone. And so they've gradually brought back the rules. And then 2 years ago, they said, okay, now that you can't set it up electronically, they were overcoming that by telling the driver what to do. And so they said, no, you're not allowed to do that. And if ever you watch Formula One, I don't know if there's any fans, and hear Lewis Hamilton, when he knows something's going wrong with the car, and he started to swear at the people, centrally, because he knows that they know what he should do, and he doesn't know what to do. And he's losing power, he's losing this, and he's getting really frustrated. So Glaxo said, we want that technology. And they brought them in, and they now have very complex analytical models which go through and identify, if you see this pattern, this is what's happening at the site. This is where we've got some potential fraud. This is where we've got surprising sloppiness. And they haven't trained all the CRAs in the risk-based approach, but they get very directed responses from the central people to say, do this, do that, do the other. It's working for them. Overall, I don't think it's the best approach. I think it's better, although longer, to train the organization and to change the mindset, to make people understand the risk-based approach. Yes, they're doing risk-based monitoring, but they're not doing the risk-based approach. They're not building the quality concept into their whole organization. They've just dealt with one part. But that's because they had an inspection finding. And so they had to respond quickly, they felt. So they're the different models that can be used. I think we will go more to this model, but then what we don't want is two people contacting the site, because that's bad news for them. I'm always told that sites don't like changes in their staff, in their CRAs, because it annoys them. And that's why we have a justification. Oh, that's why our CRAs are so important. You know that CRA managers change their CRAs that work with sites more often than there are other changes. So the turnover in CRAs per site is something like 40% per site per year, whether that's with a CRO or internal. And that's because if a site's doing well, we'll put an inexperienced person there, and we'll take the experienced person and put them elsewhere. And they're the very people who say, oh no, we have to keep a good relationship with our sites, and it's really important. And yet I don't understand it. Use the metrics. I go back to the metrics with them and ask them to explain it. So what is centralized monitoring? This triangle, the core part, and this comes from the Transcellate Central Monitoring paper. The reference is given down there, published in Tears, the DIA journal. The core part is experience and knowledge of site operations and data management. Profound knowledge. Deming's profound knowledge of the process. That's what you need. You have to understand what's going on. It's not just about the numbers. The numbers will tell you one thing, you have to interpret them. I think we'll move in future to more predictive analytical approaches. We're not there yet. Good communication. How are they going to communicate the issue they see? And good leadership. Some peripheral things. They've got to understand analytics for aggregated data. What's it telling them? How to interpret risk indicators to evaluate site performance and data quality. What are the numbers telling you? And understanding the assessment and management of risks. So that's the core one, and these are others. We also asked in that paper, we did a survey, and we asked what the desirable educational background should be. And that's the responses we got. Advanced degrees, 12, bachelor's, 5. I think that's really irrelevant if people have got the skill set. We had someone who didn't have anything, and they were our best central monitor. They were the best communicator and understanding of the metrics. And the individuals performing central monitoring, where did they come from? Which functional areas? Clinical operations was the highest one, data management, and then statistics, quality, system support. What I have seen in some companies where they've implemented central monitoring within their clinical operations group is that monitoring is still then just seen as clinical function. It's not part of data management. It's not part of stats. You have not broken down that silo. The silo still exists. It just gets worse and worse. And so you're not really using the organizational knowledge to its best. But likewise, I've seen problems where it's just been put in data management. So you have to understand what problems you're going to face and then deal with them. And for the future, although that wasn't from Translate, that's from me, root cause analysis. Understand when you get metrics, don't trust them at face value, start to delve down into the audit trail and look at causes across the study or across other studies. Again, we're very bad within the pharmaceutical industry that you only get access to your study. You don't know that if the site is in another study that you're working on, you don't even know that. You haven't even got the results. So you can't know, oh, we've got the same pattern. Who's that left to in the organization? And we've been so controlled by lawyers now and IT who say, no, security, that's it. No one can have access to this information. It's less than 1% of people have access to all the data in the pharmaceutical company. And they're the wrong 1%. So we've talked about these in part. The MHRA actually came out with their risk-based approach first. They came out with theirs in February 2011. And in some ways, their risk-based approach, although really basic, is an ideal place to start when trying to simply assess how risky a study is for a patient.
What is MHRA?
Medicines Health Regulation Authority. It's the UK authority, because although we've got the EMA, the European Medicines Association, under that you have all the national groups. And because we're leaving the umbrella of the EMA, which now makes the decision, we now have to come under a new umbrella, which is why they're talking about an affiliation with the FDA. The MHRA are probably although they're a small group, they're probably the most advanced thinking. Not just because I'm English. If you ever meet an MHRA inspector, they're tough cookies, but they really look at the process first and foremost, the overall process in the organization. They're not interested in checking basic numbers. They're not doing the SDV part. Whereas traditionally, I think the FDA, when they come in, they want to get down into the detail and replicate what you're seeing, which is why, again, SDV has grown up because of their behavior. And until some of those dinosaurs in the FDA leave, are they listening to this? Good. Yeah, until some of those dinosaurs leave or are retrained, you may still have some issues, which is why you've got to implement a quality tolerance limit on transcription errors, so that if you do get a dinosaur come in and say, you've got an error there, you can just say, it's okay, it's within our overall quality tolerance limit, which is required by the ICH. And we're working within the ICH. So I'm sorry, your major finding is no longer major because it's okay. Doesn't matter what the impact of that is, it's not important. It's a single random error. If they find a systematic error, that's a different matter. But they won't find that normally by doing heads down approach. So the MHRA actually came up with some principles on data integrity definitions. Talked about computer system validation. Of course, this has all found its way into ICH, and it found its way into the World Health Organization guidelines. We've talked about ICH E6, and we talked about a bit about the World Health Organization. It's actually called data handling. It was made final. It's Annex 5, but I will send that to you, Kira, don't worry. Basically, it's about good documentation practice. Starts from the very beginning and goes through the whole process. And as we tend to, as organizations, say, yeah, we'll follow World Health Organization principles, that's one you can ask sites, are you doing all of this? Talks about Alcoa, quality management system, computer system validation, and the whole process. And the one thing in there, it does say that management are responsible, that any person who can raise queries is trained to be able to detect fraudulent data. Because you have to recognize whether the response to your query is covering up fraud, or fraud when you first see it. Don't just send out a query because that's the rule. Look at the data and say, you know what, this isn't right. If I ask him to change it, he'll just change it to be an acceptable value. Contributing factors, this is from the FDA. Failures by organizations to apply robust systems that inhibit data risks. To improve the detection of situations where data reliability may be compromised. To investigate and address root causes when failures do arrive. That's why these documents have been put out. And that's the management should ensure staff are trained to understand and distinguish proper and improper misconduct, deliberate falsification and consequences. In the final version, they took out the querying part, but it was in the first part, which is their thought process. Again, this is industry pushing back, because they want to continue with querying. I think we'll see a mind shift change maybe over 10, 15 years with the realization data management, the querying of data is not so good. We should ignore it. We should really focus on the master data management principles, getting the data right in the first place and having a certain level of errors. Better to have random errors than fraud and misconduct. So this was our on-site monitoring that we showed before. So what's it going to look like in the future? Well, we'll extend, they won't be every 4 weeks or 8 weeks. We'll extend those visits out and we'll replace contacts by telephone contacts. But don't ask a site, have you had any protocol deviations? That's not going to be very good. Okay. No. Have you reported all the events to us? Yes. They're not good questions. What are good questions? Have you had any problems with following the protocol? Is it difficult? Maybe start to elucidate things. Have you had any problems categorizing adverse events? Are there any that have, with long-term follow-up that's needed? Just ask different questions. Have a set of questions around each one of those real issues that you want, that you can ask at different times. Otherwise, I've seen these checklists, they're completed, they mean nothing unless you put some more investigative root cause approach into asking the questions. Edit checks, entry, unfortunately, they'll still continue for the time being. But then after those internal quality review meetings, I hope we won't get boluses of queries coming out. I hope that they're all dealt with. In the future, we'll do central monitoring And maybe when we get some red sites, the site turns red, what will happen is we'll get another contact. We'll get a contact in response to the issue coming up. We might even direct them, go on site. It's important enough that you're there to detect it. So we'll have many more for cause monitoring visits. Now, what problem arises then? How do you budget for that? That's why there's a lot of pushback from the monitoring organizations. Oh, can't do that. Can't budget for it. Can't estimate what it's going to be. As a rule of thumb, if you go down to a reduced monitoring schedule, estimate that you will require an extra 30% of visits per site per year. Good. But you might have reduced overall by 60%, but then you're going to have to increase that by 30% to take account of those for cause going on site. And sometimes it's just a problem that disappears, and sometimes it's a bad site. And if it is a bad site, you might be on that site every 4 weeks. More often than you were before, more often than you ever planned. But if you have to continue running that study in that site, you're going to have to be there, because it's not going to be cured by looking at metrics. And it means going on site and doing their filing and checking their source data and correcting all their errors and pointing out everything. But that is a small number of sites, no more than 20% as rule of thumb. And that's those fewer queries, hopefully more sophisticated queries. So for the adverse events, not sending out a query immediately and eliminating the bulk queries. So looking at a hierarchy of how you would look at risks, you'll probably start off by just looking at site risks. But quickly as you develop the metrics-based methods, you'll start to escalate that up into the management tiers and say, okay, let's split it out by country, first of all, and see what impact are we seeing in the country. And then this is from an actual report where you see, okay, Great Britain looks okay, it's amber, not a problem. When you drill down, that's actually covering up a couple of red sites. So from your metrics, you can't just assume that everything's okay. That's when you drill down. You can ignore the amber and the green ones, concentrate on the black, really bad. Look down and drill down further and further to find out what is the cause. You're going to have these metrics reports over time as well. So you're going to see when did they change, when did they go black that needs immediate action. The black as a category, we use, it's less than 1% of the sites turn black, but they're really the ones that accurately predict who's going to be inspected. We used the metrics that are required in the site data set to help us produce our model, so we knew what the inspectors were looking at. And then you can determine, okay, let's do preventative work in those sites to ensure we've done the pre-inspection work, not at the end, but on a continuous basis. We're looking at what's going wrong. And those sites, we did have people out all the time. That's now been built in. Clue points are working. Do you know clue points? It's a program that has been developed based on the work by Mark Biss from his paper on misconduct and fraud in about 1999. And it correctly predicts where there's issues. It does a correlation analysis and looks across the data to predict where things are going wrong. He's now, or the company have now sold the concept to the FDA that they use that program to help determine which sites to inspect.
What's the name?
Clue points.
Clue point?
Clue points. Similar programs. What data entry system do you use? Pardon?
It depends.
It depends. Do you use Medidata? Yeah. Okay. Medidata have introduced a tool which is very similar called Central Statistical Analyzer. And that does a point-wise comparison of every data point and then uses the Mahalanobis distance. The Mahalanobis distance. He was an Indian statistician after the Second World War, foremost thinker in looking at multi-dimensional space problems, which this is. So don't try and understand it, but just know that when it's being pointed out there's an issue, it means something needs explanation. Those are different from the data that we expect to see from all the other sites or other patients. And it's a really focused method. It does take time to understand it and analyze the results, as does Clue Points. And there's another program, I said, Jump Software, that uses less sophisticated methods. That's what the FDA has, but it does predict as well. And another one would be Syntegrity. That's a German company based in Frankfurt. They have probably the best risk modeling system that's available. Really visualizes it, and you can build risks in at a company level, a trial level, a program level trial site, all the way across, and visualize it all the way across. So it enables you to drill down. So these tools are going to get more and more sophisticated and really replace what would have been the role of the statistician in analyzing this. You'll still use the statistician to help interpret sometimes. But more and more it will come down to the central monitor, who will be more a data analyst. So how is RBM going to evolve? And this is not trying to celebrate work, this is my own thoughts on it. I've divided it into people, process, and technology. What we're seeing, well, that's not current because this is before implementing RBM. That's in the early stages of RBM, middle, and then future. What we'll see in the early stages for people is the introduction of remote monitors. I think they'll go over time, and central monitors. Unless the remote monitor is just an internal CRA doing telephone calls, handling, you tend to find that on-site monitors are better with the direct approach on site. When it comes to deal with the sites on the telephone, they're not so good. You find some really skilled people there that you're going to probably elevate more to this position to handle multiple sites, maybe 30, 40 different sites, and be the telephone contact. Central monitor is key. As you get to the mid stages, you really realize you need a clinical risk manager, someone who really understands risk. It's probably going to come out from the central monitor group, that one of them will say, you know, they'll come to a study and say, this is where your risks are. And they'll be able to explain it to the team and know how to measure those metrics and really bring that together. So that's the changes you'll see there. In terms of process, seen this already, start doing a preliminary risk assessment. All too often, this is done after the study's protocol's been finalized. That has to come earlier. You'll start to do remote monitoring, central monitoring. Start with reduced SDV and SDR and doing risk management. Then as the time goes on, systematic risk assessment will come in. So you'll be looking at the company or the organization. you all know yourself what your issues are. If you've got, you're on a trial team and the on-site monitor has 5 other studies and 15 other sites, they're not going to have much time for yours. Likewise, if it's a project manager who's dealing with 5 other protocols, don't expect that he'll do a good job on your protocol. There'll be targeted on-site visits developing. So you'll start to think, okay, we don't need to go so often. In this model, people have just started to say, we'll go every 3 months, every 6 months. They're not adapting it. You'll get to the targeted because you realize you have to do that. People start to introduce unreported event review. They may call it something else, but that's essentially the category. And they'll introduce an analytics library. They'll get more sophisticated and realize, we're going to reuse this. This becomes important. In the end stage, you get to targeted on-site visits only. You really do eliminate that. And that's some time off. I'm only dealing with one company who's got that in their 5-year plan. That's what they're going for. They want to know how to get there, and I'm helping them in model that. In terms of technology, currently it's tracking logs, goes to a central dashboard. As I said earlier, central dashboard is not the best way because you're treating every study the same, and that's not the way you should be doing it. And standard analytics. It soon comes onto custom analytics, therapeutic area, indication, or trial, that you start to get workflows in for how to handle issues. Do you have an issue management system? No. Most sponsors are really finding that they've really got to push for this. They misunderstood when the FDA and the EMA were talking about issue handling. They thought they just meant CAPAs, and they all introduced CAPA systems. That's not what they meant. It was the basic handling of issues coming from sites, internally within the organization. Get rid of your spreadsheets that you communicate with and have a managed organized system. And then in the future, automated analytics. Going through, much as American Express have got their checks, which automatically, it's a computer check which fires out a question to you. Well, we can get to that. I already know some of the methods, and there's 2 sponsors are implementing those. So they've got an immediate warning of fraud or misconduct. Next generation systems, because currently the systems out there are not good enough. And we'll also be talking about e-source. How are we going to do with an electronic source and electronic medical records? How are we going to do the risk-based approach there? Because you're going to have to do it. Now, ICH is working on that in their renovation of ICH. There's a 60-day comment period that's going to be up soon, and then they're going to start action in that. My predictions in what we'll do in terms of SDV, SDR, and UER, of course, these didn't exist. But SDV, well, I put 100%, really we weren't doing 100%. But it was unknown what we were doing. In those first stages, companies, they're reducing some. They're very reluctant. They're very fearful of taking it all away. We did get down to about 5% within Boehringer. What 5% actually means, though, if you've only got 1 patient at the site, 5% actually means you're doing 100%. So if you model it out, 5% actually equates over a reasonably sized study to around 14% of the data. If you say you're doing 25%, then it actually models out to about 41% of the data. So when they're saying they're doing 40% on a random basis, it probably equates more to 60% of data. So that's not very conservative, and that's why companies are not seeing any benefit or payback yet. This will go down, initially more and more. I think we'll see UER increase, first of all, when it's introduced, but then it will reduce because we'll get better at predicting who we should be going to see and how we should be managing that process. So overall, we're going to have to work smarter. Move from our reactive basis that we currently have. First of all, it would be more proactive and then predictive. Have intelligent KRIs that use Deming's profound knowledge of the process, implementing that thought process into the KRIs. And we talked about some of this. If you want to identify sites of missed event, don't look at low reporting. Key risk indicator. That's a term generally used throughout risk-based monitoring and the papers. So lower event reporting, there is a normal distribution, a bell-shaped curve, of how events would be reported. So some sites will be low and some sites will be high, and it doesn't mean they've missed anything. So it's not a good predictive. What I did when we used it, because we did use that one in our first studies, but then I looked for the indicators that where sites had missed events, and I can tell you it's not at all predictive. We could have just randomly stuck a pin in and it would have been as good. So I then went back to the data, reanalyzed and said, what are the predictors? And then think, why are they predictors? And the predictors are a high number of adverse event queries. And then you say, well, why does that make a difference? And of course, it's because we send out adverse event queries, they'll put it to one side and wait till later to report it. But they're humans, so they forget to report. And the late event reporting is another symptom of that. Why are they late in reporting? Because they've held it back. They don't intend to not report it, so that's an indicator they might be doing that practice again in the future. Now, where this sometimes will fall down is if you're starting with a site which has already been trained by another company in bad processes. And so you, right from the get-go, they start with that. It doesn't have to be high queries. They're going to be late straight away. Risk of important protocol violations or protocol deviations. Looking for an existing protocol violation is not good because important protocol deviations or violations, we get in about 5% of the patients. Well, only looking at that top 5% is not a good predictor. Look for poor Alcoa. Look for a high number of queries. Look for late response to queries. All indicating a lack of understanding of the protocol, a lack of compliance, maybe bad practice that is going to lead into those problems. Looking for loss to follow-up patients. If you look as when they get to the end of the study, if they're lost to follow-up, that's not going to help you at all. Look where you've got treatment discontinuations, dropouts, because a patient who drops out is going to be more likely to be lost to follow-up. Missed visits, they start missing visits, they're going to be the ones. They, in themselves, a missed visit is not a high risk. It will happen in long-term studies. But it is a better indicator that you're potentially going to lose contact with the patient. So should you do something? And then, having got these warning signals, what is the on-site monitor or whoever's going to contact them going to discuss with them? How are they going to approach this issue? It's not retraining. So what are we going to see in the future? Well, we'll see a greater two-way integration in systems, in particular with RDC, your electronic data capture system and your risk-based approach. They've got to be communicating far more. The risk-based approach really does need access to the audit trail and utilize some of that data to predict problems. Improve querying, having intelligent querying, maybe set a tolerance limit on your own data management department to say that they've got to raise 95% of queries within 3 days. It's a quality measure. Why would you not do that? Look at trending to examine the impact. So work out what worked. The Deming plan, do, study, act. The study is examining what you did and whether it was successful, and then acting upon it. Some people refer to what Schuhart said. Schuhart, remember the earlier statistician? He said, plan, do, check, act. But when they get to the check, they tick the box. They don't examine what was wrong. That's why Deming changed the concept to plan, do, study, with the emphasis on the study and the analytics to find out. Support quality tolerance limits. Determine which ones you're going to use. That is a completely different presentation. There wasn't enough time this time, but I've just done a 3-hour session on that yesterday. Integration of CAPA and knowledge management into the QMS together with the quality tolerance limits. Analysis of deviations. How you analyze those is a completely new area. Your statisticians will not be used to doing it. Your quality people won't be used to doing it because it is analytics to them, and to the statisticians, they're not used to using their knowledge in that way. So for staff, you're going to focus on training in analytics and better root cause analysis and what that really means in an electronic environment. How often in an audit do the QA people actually go back to the audit trail and examine what went on? Not often, if ever. I've never seen it. Why? Because we're so siloed, we don't even give them access to it. Happy to take any questions. Yeah. What you do is you scan the source documents against the list that you've got from the database, just the name and the date of the event. You don't go into more detail than that. It's a very quick review just to say, have all the events that I see in the source notes been reported? So, the on-site monitor. It's the on-site monitor. I would say it's an essential part of on-site monitoring because from the Confidentiality paper, we identified that almost 12%, 11.8% of adverse events were not reported by the site and were found by the on-site monitor, and almost 4% of the SAEs. Now, I'd say that's far more important than 1% transcription errors, which were random errors mainly. So I'd say that's an essential task that we should try and build up, but we should put that into the context of having your overall quality tolerance limits. I can give more information on that. I can send it to Kira if you like. It's my term. I try to get Confidentiality to introduce it. Unfortunately, Boehringer pulled me out of the group because there was some anti-competitive behavior issues with our lawyers. And I was pulled out of the group when I was due to present this concept to them, and then they made the decision they'd just go with SDV and SDR. Some of the Confidentiality companies include unreported event review in SDV, others include it in SDR, and others have got it as a separate category. So we've got a mess at present, and it needs to be redefined and brought together. But I don't think Confidentiality will do that. But it is important, and it's just important to know how to do it. So I'll set that information to Kira. That's you. It depends on the situation. Now, as I said, I did a presentation 3 hours on this yesterday, a sponsor. It's going into examples of where you've set a quality tolerance limit, what the issue was, and in some cases we found it was economic fraud was going on. But you had to look at the patterns, you had to have the understanding of what was going on. So it's not a quick yes or no, and this is one metric you can look at. It's thinking, this is all the data available to me. When I see this, what could I look at to say, is this a random effect or not? So one of those examples was that because in that study where we had the inclusion-exclusion protocol deviations, what we actually found, we did breach the tolerance limit. We had too many. And what was said in each individual site, it was a training issue because the sites had miscalculated the percentage of predicted to allow the patient to enter the study. So what we did is said, well, if that truly is a miscalculation issue and there was no pattern to it, then let's look back at the database at all data changes for that variable and see if we've got an equal number of increases and decreases, which would indicate it's random. When we look back, it was over 80% of the changes were decreases which allowed the patients to enter the study. So is that random now? No. So it was economic fraud. Or they wanted the patients in the study, so they pushed them in. But in every single case, and we didn't have too many for each site, maybe 2 was the most, but there were a lot of them. There were 250 in our study that shouldn't have been there, where they'd pushed them in. And so what we would have to do is do a sensitivity analysis. Now, because it was an inclusion-exclusion criteria, we already did a sensitivity analysis, because you do that. But what we needed to do was a sensitivity analysis on only those that are decreased, because they're the ones that have been pushed in. So it just focuses your mind what you really need to look at and why, what's the linkage round. And that it was using the audit trail to say, well, are these changes random or not? But you have to think of a concept. And I've got several other examples I can show you. Next question.
I have actually a similar question. I was
I've got more root cause analysis at an overall trial level that goes along with the quality tolerance limits, because it's really difficult to look in isolation at a single case. It's better to look at the patterns that you're seeing across the study, which is what the FDA are seeing. Now, yes, we can do better root cause analysis at the site, and I do have 1 or 2 examples of that. But again, that's a different presentation. You'll have to talk to Kira. Okay.
I'm curious if in all of this work, if you have any information about the costs associated with, I mean, I'm thinking about the slide where you had in the progression of folks going from traditional monitoring to advanced risk-based monitoring. If anybody knows yet, I mean, if it's more expensive or less expensive.
In our first study that we did, we saved approximately 50 million. But it was a 70,000 patient study. We were monitoring 25% of the subjects. But we used quality tolerance limits in many different areas. Almost immediately after we started the study, the lead clinical person suddenly said, you know, this is a cardiovascular outcome study, albeit in respiratory area. I want every person's medical history checked fully. And we were only checking 25%. And so
They thought that was a safety issue?
They said, yeah, it's too important. We can't afford to miss any of this. So we estimated what the cost would be. It was going to be about 19 million because COPD patients have notes this thick. They've had so many hospitalizations. They're tested for everything when they go into hospital. So they have ECGs when they don't need them, just to make sure. What we did is said, okay, let's look at the first 1,000 patients where we have checked their full medical history. Then look and see, were there any changes in cardiovascular medical history after a CRA visit, indicating that the CRA had found something and they'd asked them to redocument it. And we set a tolerance limit around that. We expect, because we didn't set it initially, this was only after the study initiated, we were ultra conservative. We said we expect the normal error rate based on data, and this was a pre-Translate rate, was 2%. And so we had to be below that lower limit, and so we had to be below 0.63% of errors. Now, I've got the metrics I could show you. We were inside that. So we assessed the first 1,000 patients and just ran a program to check it. We documented that, and that formed part of the trial report. All of this quality data, we had an issue. We had another issue from an inspection. Formed at one site where they said this wasn't a patient reminder card, it was a diary, and therefore it should be monitored, and we weren't monitoring it. So they said we had to go back and monitor 10 times 17,000 diary cards. Patient reminder cards. And what cost would that be? Again, we used metrics. We took a sample and said, this is the sample, go out, look at these patients. If you're below this tolerance limit, we'll accept that it's okay. Using metrics, it's a quality definition. Saved millions. I didn't see any of that. I was really disappointed.
Well, yeah, so I guess there's that story isn't published anywhere.
No. The company doesn't like to publish that. The analysis we did on duplicates, on blood pressure, that is in the clinical trial report, and that is on clinicaltrial.gov, on the data transparency website. So, and if any of you have never done a study in a certain indication, well, why not go to the data transparency website? You're all aware of that? Let me show you. Oh my goodness me. That would be another presentation, I'm sorry. This is the data transparency website. I'm actually on as a user, so I'm going to log in. Because I want to do my own research. You have to put in a valid research application. But that's not a problem. But you'll be amazed at how much information is there. So let's get started. All these companies have put data up there. Glaxo have about 1,200 studies. And so if you want to request data, you can first of all select, let's do a medicine. Let's do tiotropium. So we'll page down through this. It's a free website, which you can do a submission to that you want to have data sent to you. It actually gets put on a SaaS server, and you can analyze it on that SaaS server. The data is anonymized before you get it. And you can see all the different Glaxo products in there. Let's a bit further down. These are all different products up there. Yeah, there's a few. Let's try. Oh, that's the one. Yeah. These are only on completed studies. Completed studies. And they say normally it's 1 year after the study has finished, the data is uploaded.
Are they clinical trial reports or are they?
I'll show you what's in there. So we'll do a search, and it's going to come up with, I think, about 45 different studies, or even more. Let's see.
What's the drug again?
Oh, this was tiotropium. I think I must have clicked off that. If we click on this Novartis compound, let's see what they're offering at the bottom. They can supply the analysis-ready data set, reporting and analysis plan, the clinical study report, the raw data, annotated case report form, data set specifications, and protocol with any amendments. Now, what you have to do when you do a submission, you have to promise to do a publication on the data that you receive. And this is for, they have an independent ethics body that reviews the application to decide on whether it's a legitimate request. It can only be done on the indication area that you specified for the study, because the patient is only given their authority for it to be used in that way. But if you want to look at the impact of adverse events within an indication area you're interested in, if it's COPD, choose the COPD studies and look there. Every month new studies go up. So this one was up in February 2017. I think in total there's close to 3,000 studies up there. Why, as a research body, would you not be accessing this for your research purposes to find out general issues?
So I'm, I think, a little bit confused about what you just said. So is the, in order to get something from this site, you have to agree to publish a paper?
Yes. You have to submit a valid research proposal.
Okay.
Not, we want to see what data you had.
It's not just for looking at stuff.
It's not just for looking, it's for doing valid research so that all that medical knowledge that has been gained from doing clinical trials is not just lost. This was in response to an EMA initiative where they said, well, we're just going to put all your results out anyway. And so the company said, oh no, we want it in a controlled manner. We want this data anonymized, so it strips off certain data. You don't know which site it was. You know the sex. You don't know the exact age. It's given in groupings. You don't know the exact location in the country. And if there's only one site in the country, then they may put it in a grouping of countries, so Northern Europe. Just so that you can't say, oh, well, if it's that study, I know from ct.gov that only one site was in that country and I know their location. Therefore, from patient details, you could, it is possible if you had the age and the sex, you can identify probably 60 to 70% of these via social media, because people put so much information on social media that you know who they are. And so we were protecting ourselves. I was in on the development of this, so we actually modeled how to try and eliminate most of these issues. You can't download the raw data. It's put on a SAS server, and you can analyze it on that SAS server and download the results, the summary results. Has anyone heard of Project Sphere? This is an initiative from SAS Software using a similar type of service where they get all the placebo results from patients who've done cancer studies. And it's an area where cancer researchers can go on to, and companies, anyone can go on to it and analyze the impact of cancer over time and looking at that and looking at the different treatments used. So if you're doing cancer research, you should be on Project Sphere as well. But, you know, so for some of your researchers, you don't have to do an expensive study. You can think of a concept, put it in here, and probably the biggest cost of doing research in this area is setting up a clinical trial. You may have all the information you need. And if not, you can probably model it around this. Well, what's the future? Modeling. What the ICH wants us to do? Modeling. Yeah, my own proposal that I put in is on adverse event reporting, because although I know that that curve fall off of adverse event reporting over time because of the patient visit window, I know that's true because I analyzed it on data when I was in a company. I was not allowed to present that data. So now I've got to repeat it, but I'm also going back to other companies' data, so I'm going to take 2 in the cardiovascular area, 2 projects in the respiratory area, a couple in diabetes, to show the same issue and propose different methods of handling that for the future. Okay, if there's no further questions, thank you very much.
Yeah, I got it. I got to meet Peter. Is it really just 2? I know, I was trying to decide if I had to walk all the way down there and then walk back, but I really should. So I should pull my but I'll talk to you about it later. If you're going, I'll raise your hand.
Yeah, separate. That you will have to contact ECR.
You can also walk to the hospital and
That's true too.
Well, so what the review for the what I'm able, I haven't contacted about credit, so I think you would have to, but I can send you an email that you sent today, which you need. So it's for, yeah.
Thank you very much. It was delightful to meet you.
Thank you.
I have some thoughts about having some other classes.
Okay.
Sarah and I will be
In touch.
Just hi, I'm Leilani. Just wanted to say thank you so much
you're
for
welcome.
coming, and this was very, very valuable information. And I hope you come back to us soon.
Well, I'm probably back on the West Coast, definitely in November.
November?
Yeah, October, November. I'm at a user group meeting, and we could probably schedule something around then without you having to pay.
Okay.
Well, we're in discussion with Kiri.
Okay,
well.
that's so very
Okay.
well. Really appreciate it.
Okay,
Thank you
thank you.
again.
Sometimes it's useful and sometimes.
No, it's, like you and Lisa both said, it is a complicated
It's a
topic.
huge amount of information.
It's not an easy thing.
No.
It's not, it's not as straightforward.
Yeah, it's not
As I thought a long time ago. And so it's nice though, because you learn.
Are you leaving right away?
No, well, in a few minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Nick is about 30 minutes away. He
Oh,
said
is
if
it?
you want, yeah.
Oh,
so-
well, I'll wait 30 minutes, of course,
Great,
yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah.
Yeah.
He wants to meet.
Oh, he's picking you up to take you.
He's picking me up.
Good.
We're taking a dog to the vet.
Okay. Are you far from here then?
I live about an hour away.
Oh, near San Francisco.
I work in South San Francisco, but I live in the East Bay across the bay.
Okay, so you've got a long
Yeah.
commute in the morning. Oh
Bad
my
traffic.
God.
Yeah, he'll be here soon.
Yeah, I just discussed something with Kira, and then we can go out. And
Excellent.
so how did you get here?
He dropped me off.
Yeah, he dropped you.
Yeah.
So it's.
That's good.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
So I think
Yeah,
I'll get water.
I'm just gonna.
You don't know what you're talking about.
Monday, right? Monday? Yes, or no, it's the Monday after.
Oh, right, yeah, okay.
I'll see you on Wednesday for the Thanks, Karen. Good questions there.
Yeah. Oh, take this off now. It's a bit loud. So I'm going to be back